Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Hinge Points. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with Matt Christman. This week, we're going to talk about one of the most important turning points in not only American but world history, and that is essentially the presidency of Harry Truman. Begins with the death of FDR in 1945 and takes us through the early 1950s and really gets the Cold War going. So this is really a crucial moment for several reasons. Now, the United States, in a lot of ways, is imperial from the very beginning. You can think of Western expansion as the first instance of American imperialism, the expansion to the West Coast. You get the War of 1898, and you get the American seizure of colonies in the Philippines and Puerto Rico and elsewhere in the world. But it's only really after World War II that the American empire takes the form with which we are familiar, a form that's truly global in scope. And in a real way, the American empire of the World War II and post-World War II period is the first truly global empire in world history. Neither the Romans nor the Ottomans nor even the British were truly global in scale like the American empire, with its hundreds of military bases, its enormous defense budget, and everything that makes it so great to be an American today. But what we're going to focus on is the particular moment of this transition point in the 1940s and 1950s when Truman set the United States on this course. And we're going to ask whether something could have been different, whether the American empire could have not have been or could have taken a different form.
And I think the most intriguing element of this, the reason that it is a hinge point as opposed to something that's overly determined like the flow of history often seems to be, is that you had in the White House until the crucial moment as the war was ending, similarly as you had as the Civil War was ending, a United States president who had presided over an entire epoch of America changing from one sort of state into another, gaining functions and abilities and structures and literally like a self-awareness that it didn't have beforehand. And FDR presided over this entire process while negotiating this power alliance between the traditional finance capital of the East Coast, America's manufacturing capital, the working class as represented in labor unions, and then their activism within the Democratic Party, but also, the Communist Party and all sorts of radical formations within the United States at that time. All of them allied in this moment of crisis in a popular front against fascism and in collaboration with this capitalist government. And then you had the mass of Americans who, by the end of the war, had identified Franklin Roosevelt with this entire process and who had a deep filial relationship with. Even though he was ailing in 1944 and was seeking an unprecedented fourth term, there was essentially no internal resistance to him running again at that point because of his deep identification with the war effort, but also the effort to build a state that could win the war. And in so doing, the person of Roosevelt we see in his governance, in the way he responded to Stalin and Churchill in negotiating the course of the war, but also the way that he related to the incipient anti-colonial movements in the rest of the world and in the anti-American national movements within Latin America, where the Monroe Doctrine had by long time had certainly by now completely wore out its welcome. And you see this willingness to imagine the post-war world as a continuation of the collaboration that had won the war, a collaboration between the United States and the Soviet Union and the peoples of the colonialized world seeking national self-determination, instead of what we got, which is capital-directed war on behalf of a new American imperial machine.
And I think it's really important here to highlight the person of Roosevelt. And this is crucial not only for explaining this particular moment in American history, but it's also crucial for asking the larger question of how much agency do particular historical actors have in a particular moment, or does structure define everything? Was a Cold War inevitable, or was the death of FDR the really crucial thing that allowed the Cold War to happen? And this is really crucial because I think as Marxists, both Matt and I tend to the side of structure, tend to the side of large-scale historical change, ultimately rooted in the means of production, who controls them, how and why, and how transformations in capitalism engender macro shifts in American history and in global history. But I do think, at least for me, and I'd like to hear what you think about this, this is one of the instances where the death of Roosevelt actually pushes things in a particular direction for a variety of reasons. So as you said, Roosevelt is really crucial because he essentially in the 1930s and through the New Deal creates the capacity for the modern American state. Famously, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and a bunch of other of these regulatory agencies are created by Roosevelt, the so-called alphabet soup agencies, the WPA, the CCC, all of these things. And this really does, for the first time in American history, begin building a state capacity. And this is crucial to our story because it's Truman who in the late 1940s undertakes what some historians, and I think this is a good way of looking at it, refer to as the Second New Deal, the sort of second structure of alphabet soup agencies, the NSC, the National Security Council, the NSA, the National Security Agency, the CIA, the DOD. All of these alphabet soup agencies are essentially the continuations of the New Deal, but to manage instead of an emergent American state. It's to manage a global order, a global imperial order. So FDR is really crucial for, I think, laying the groundwork for the state. But he's also crucial because as a person, he has a very particular relationship with people like Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, and particularly his relationship with Stalin, I believe was close enough that you would have been able to actually avoid the Cold War that quickly emerged. And it's because Truman didn't have that, not only didn't have that relationship that Roosevelt had with Stalin, but was, I think, insecure, was trying to assert American might, that you get the Cold War in the form that it took.
Absolutely. I mean, when it was FDR, Stalin, and Churchill in a room, the odd man out was always Churchill, and he knew it. My favorite story about that is they're sitting around deciding what to do with post-war Germany, and Stalin makes the absolutely reasonable suggestion that they should have gone with, that they need to execute the top 50,000 members of the German military officer class. And Churchill just goes red in the face at the very prospect of executing people who are fighting for their country. And FDR says, well, how about 40,000? And it gets Churchill so mad that he almost leaves the room. Like, Churchill... yeah, he was the guy defending this like rump delusional empire that was literally at this point already dead and didn't know it. Of course, it was being represented by this pathetic martinet. But whereas Stalin stood for a Soviet experiment that had like seen the limits of its abilities and is like confronting them and certainly now knows like what it takes to survive. And a guy in Roosevelt who I think genuinely did believe that he was managing a transition away from capitalism. I do believe he thought he was doing that.
I think he thought that in the next couple of generations there was going to be a transition. I think that's fair.
Yes. And of course, you know, for an orthodox communist, you say, well, fuck that. That's fantasy revisionism. But he's the last American president to think that. That needs to be remembered. Like, this is the end of that idea that a president could operate on the assumption that he is part of a project that abolishes capitalism. That's over with the death of FDR. And as materialists, though, we would have to stress, like, his particular desires are beside the fact, except for the fact that he is representing a massive coalition, and his personal views are therefore meaningful because he can marshal that part of his coalition the same way he did to defeat John Nance Garner at the 1940 nomination. John Nance Garner, Cactus Jack Garner from Texas, the Democratic Speaker of the House, had been FDR's running mate in 1932. And he represented the Southern, more reactionary wing of the party. And he dutifully served for 8 years as vice president, hated every minute of it, famously described the job as not worth a bucket of warm spit or piss, depending on your preference, and did this with the assumption that after FDR had served his 2 terms, which everyone had understood since Washington is how many terms you serve, that he would get the nomination. And FDR challenged him at the convention. And even with the entire South behind Garner, the business interest behind Garner, and precedent behind Garner, FDR got that nomination because he had this support. Now, by 1944, the focus had become so much on winning the war that domestic politics had sort of atrophied, which is one of the reasons why when the Senate Democrats insist on replacing the populist Puritan gentleman Henry Wallace with Truman on the ticket, that Truman was unable to resist them. But from a position of still being the president, it's easy to imagine him pushing forward with his nascent plans to press the Europeans to decolonize as soon as possible and to provide the sort of Marshall Plan aid that Europe got for the entire world. And, of course, that would have caused a massive response from capital, but it would have been in a context where that project is seated at the height of executive power, which is considerable at this point. Hypothetically, this is when the leader of the free world becomes a guy, and this could be the guy. But FDR dies, and honestly, you can't really get rid of FDR dying because by 1945, he was absolutely horrible shape. I believe his last physical before he went to Hot Springs to recover and died, his over-the-line blood pressure was like 400 over 250 or something like that. The kind of thing that like a modern doctor would have said, okay, let's do something about this. So he was done. So the real what if is if there had been a different array of forces at the convention to keep Wallace on the ticket, Henry Wallace, who is the next step from FDR in the terms of a patrician from the bowels of American capitalism who had been culturally turned towards socialism, that would have been Wallace. But instead, he was replaced by the machine hack Harry Truman, who's owed his entire political allegiance and his entire political identity to the Democratic Party, stripped of any ideological concerns whatsoever.
And I think in a real way, it's useful to think of Harry Truman as kind of a Joe Biden-esque figure, or rather Joe Biden as a Harry Truman-esque figure, and that he's a politician of an earlier age. If you think of the people that kind of define the presidents of the early Cold War, you have Eisenhower, who's a military guy, you have Kennedy, who's probably the first meritocrat, and then you have Johnson, who's probably the last genuinely machine politician that we've had run the United States until Joe Biden. And so you have these different formations forming different things. And what happens is that over the course of the middle to late 1940s, Truman, who genuinely feels himself, I think at least, outstripped when he's dealing with someone like Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, or when he's trying to deal with Stalin. He makes a series of insecure decisions that eventually result in the World War II alliance, the United Nations as it was called at the time, and that's why the institution is named the United Nations, essentially falling apart relatively quickly. So that by 1947, essentially the Cold War breaks out. The division of Germany is solidified. The Western allies of France, the United Kingdom, and the United States solidify into their own zone against the Soviet zone. Stalin basically makes it clear in a June 1946 speech that he doesn't think capitalism and communism are able to live together. And then you have strategic documents like George Kennan's famous long telegram arguing essentially in what I think is one of the greatest acts of projection in American history, that the Soviet Union was dedicated to world domination and therefore the United States needed to dominate the core areas of the world. And Truman essentially abides by the opinions of the generals, abides by people in the State Department like Kennan, and he launches the Cold War. He really institutionalizes a world system, a Manichaean world system in which the United States and its allies and fellow travelers are considered to be the free world, and the Soviet Union and its allies and fellow travelers are considered to be what was called at the time the slave world. And then he does things like get involved in Korea, which gives the money to make the Cold War into a real thing, setting the stage, I think without exaggeration, for the entire 4-decade plus history of the Cold War. And so the great question is what if it wasn't Harry Truman, but what if it was Henry Wallace who was vice president? And this is a real question because immediately after he is no longer vice president, Wallace becomes commerce secretary, I believe, under FDR. He actually becomes the editor of the New Republic, and he's really kind of a one world guy. He is skeptical of communism, and I think it's important not to overstate his ideological affinity, but I don't think he was dedicated to the type of Manichaean struggle that would have that broke out in the Cold War.
Well, more importantly than his personal views on communism, and I do believe that he had that same Yankee disdain for communism that Upton Sinclair had, another sort of Puritan liberal. But what mattered is that his staff and supporters were all fucking communists. Like, not only were they sympathizers and fellow travelers, many of them were active members of the Communist Party. This is a thing that later reactionaries would point to as evidence of the need for a Red Scare. But of course, what they're really pointing to is their opponents in a battle for control of the Democratic Party and the direction of the American state after World War II. And the Red Scare is what we got because they won. And they won in large part because the guy in the room was not a fellow traveler, a dupe, a useful idiot for the communist cause. It was this machine hack from Missouri who was doing what his party bosses wanted, which was what their bosses wanted, American capital, which was war footing for the economy forever, which meant conflict with the Soviets. It meant imposing terms on every country we could and extracting cheap resources to feed a new industrial economy that would roar with profits and that would be stabilized by a modest redistribution downward, but that was premised on imperial super profits.
Why don't you talk quickly about Wallace and who he was? Because I think his transformation from basically Republican populist to Democratic Party elite says something about the course of political history over the course of the first half of the 20th century.
So there's two ways that you come to the left broadly. There is the experience of labor, but then there is what is much more common in the American tradition because of America's exceptional relationship to capital formation. I mean, America is literally exceptional to the other developed nations because it was able to alleviate its social conflicts through this free real estate giveaway that no other European state, even in imperialism, could really match. And that did give it different institutions and different parties and stuff like that. But you still have, even with that, thanks to the Depression, by the 30s, a very militant, organized, working class left movement, including people who were self-identified communists at every level of the labor movement. The Congress of Industrial Organizations breaks away from the American Federation of Labor to pursue a more radical conflict with capitalism in the 30s and is chock-a-block with very dedicated, very intelligent communist operatives who are coming out of the labor movement. But the other way, the way more that is common in this middle-class country we have, is through affect and through personal morality. And that means that the archetypal progressive and liberal who emerges from the middle class is horrified by capital's excesses and tries to ameliorate them technocratically through technocracy of government, which is what the progressive movement was, and then through technocracy of administration. Henry Wallace was an agricultural expert, and he helped codify the first agricultural subsidy program in America to prevent the sort of mass farm ruination that happened during the Dust Bowl. And that tradition, that better government tradition in the middle of the country, was Republican. It was a residue of that old abolitionist Republican Party. The Democratic Party in those parts of the country represented drunk Irish in the cities and Jim Crow Klansmen in the South. It was not a party of advancement. It was not a progressive party. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, was. And that's where you saw that energy flowed. This is the same sort of current that produces later radicals like George McGovern. But at that point, it's in flux between the Republican and Democratic parties. But then it is the New Deal and the Democratic Party putting itself to the mission of reforming capitalism radically that draws all of these erstwhile Republicans to it. Like Fiorello LaGuardia, the fusion Republican mayor of New York, endorses and supports FDR all through the New Deal. So Wallace is being pulled by this moral repugnance for capitalism that is failing and a technocratic desire to find a cure. And that technocratic cure in the 1910s was, civil service reform and regulation and maybe a graduated income tax. But by the 30s by the war era, the insufficiency of that is pretty clear. And so now the technocratic, earnest, liberal prescription for the American capitalism is for it to be euthanized and for it to be replaced by scientific socialism. And that is the current behind like elite adherence to the Communist Party and to this project that will now fight for control with the machine itself over the course of Truman's presidency.
And so if we imagine that Wallace is in there when FDR dies and that he's the presidency, this raises, again, a lot of really interesting counterfactual questions because there are a lot of different interests operating at the time. On one hand, there's a genuine anti-communism within the elite of the American state, in the business class, in the military, a general skepticism of the Soviet Union. The romance of American communism did genuinely begin to attenuate amongst the elite American liberals after the Moscow trials of the 1930s and particular turns Stalin took. So there is this big anti-communist strand of thinking and interest group that isn't going to go away. So I think it's interesting to think about Wallace because I think it's critical to think of what elements of the Cold War would have been different in the light of this overdetermination of anti-communism and, psychopathic American desire, which emerges from the Puritan heart of the country to really dominate the world, which is evident in American history from John Winthrop's 1630 City Upon a Hill speech all the way forward, in my opinion. There's a universalizing impulse to the American project that goes from sea to shining sea and eventually over the globe, and eventually, as we're seeing with our current oligarchs like Bezos and Musk, who is essentially an American to the moon, precisely. So there is that element there. But what I do think would have been different under Wallace is I think whatever form that emergent national security state took, it wouldn't have been the peculiar form that it wound up taking, which is this public-private partnership. And that's crucial because by creating, for example, by having the American research apparatus exist primarily in think tanks or at Ivy League universities, which is what Truman did and was an effort that Truman and Eisenhower in particular promoted because in some real way they were skeptical, at least in some regard, about large state power. I don't think you would have necessarily gotten that under Wallace. And that's crucial because when an institution like, let's say, the Rand Corporation, which is the first think tank in modern American history, is outside the official structures of the American state, it's very difficult to regulate and it's very difficult to figure out what's going on. And it's not a surprise, for example, that Daniel Ellsberg had to steal the Pentagon Papers from the Rand Corporation, which is where he was an employee. So I think under Wallace, there would have been a general skepticism of those private, what they called at the time, private interests that just really wasn't there under Truman, and that Truman in a genuine way allowed himself to be pushed around by what might be considered the elite conservative reaction, people like Vannevar Bush, people who are pushing the American state in a particular way where it's not really a state but an amalgamation of public and private institutions that exist in different places of the country and that are subject to different forms of authority.
I think the crucial thing with Truman is that when these guys are pushing this on him, they're pushing against an open door because he has no prior commitments to the project. He has no personal psychic investment. He has not supplanted his ego to a project. Like FDR, like all American presidents, is a fucking ego monster. Was a demon. Was trying to like turn himself into a god. Horrifying. But his idea of what that meant was socialism. Like he is imagining himself as like a founding father of a new rationalized, humane human order. So he was invested in that. And Wallace, consumed by the exact same idea, would have also pursued that same dream, and the full-blown commies around him would have certainly helped. Truman had none of that. He was a failed haberdasher who became a judge because he got a favor from the Pendergrast machine in Kansas City, and then they pushed him up through the ranks. Politics was, as Wax Weber said, a vocation for him. It was not in a place for him to have feelings or believe anything. He had, I'm sure, beliefs, and he seems to have like gotten very invested in the idea of, creating universal health care. And he did have a genuine antipathy toward like the fat cats who ran the country, but he had no connection to a movement. He had no connection to a program. And so when he comes under pressure from these institutions and the representatives of them, there is no pushback. he is going to take the path of least resistance. And since there's no resistance within him, it's always going to flow towards what capital wants. And I think one of the fundamental branchings in American history is the fact that Wallace was already on record before the 44 election on opposing the private copywriting of publicly discovered scientific research. And this process that defines the Cold War, a hugely intensive state investment in a military-based Keynesianism, producing all of these amazing technological advancements that are all subsequently privatized, that are all subsequently copyrighted and turned into private property, even though they were all produced publicly. And that process begins under Truman, and this copyright regime emerges where, because at the end of the day, capital doesn't want the state to have that much access to that much like actual technological power, potential, leverage. It has to be privatized. It has to be pulled towards profit. And that magnet pulled it all. It sucked it up. And now we live in a world, a post-democratic order, where there's so much technology in private hands that it's almost impossible to imagine a political response to capital, because so much of our world is not conducted politically, it's conducted technologically. And all of that technology is privately held. And that is a fundamental distinction between Wallace and Truman. And if you imagine Wallace pursuing that as a public policy, he's not going to get a lot of pushback from people. There's going to be the same thing that happened under FDR, which is a capital-led propaganda effort against the New Deal and against whatever this would have been. And it would have had adherents, particularly among the precarious petty bourgeois, who are always there to fight on behalf of capital at its most agitated. But you would not have any kind of like popular groundswell on behalf of private copyright. And if that happens, I do think the question we have to answer now is, we are imagining a world where capital is put to a existential point. Like, this is, like we said, a hinge point, and capital recognized it as such. The reason humanity lost is because we had not yet achieved the ability to recognize it as such. Maybe FDR could have recognized it as such, but his goddamn brain exploded. We can recognize it as this moment when capital went on the offensive. And you have to imagine that if a guy like Wallace was able to be a conduit for a unification of this movement from the grassroots of factory workers who supported these labor unions, within the cadres of the CIO and the Communist Party, all the forces of the Popular Front that were there ideologically, that were motivated by this project of human liberation of the working class of the world, if they had all flocked to this banner of Wallace's, there would have to be some reckoning.
I think you really hit the nail on the head, and I think to understand why, we've got to go a little bit back to the 1930s. So the 1930s is in my opinion, probably the most important decade in the 20th century, because it's where a lot of the currents that we're still dealing with, even a lot of the political language, everyone's talking about fascism today and totalitarianism and authoritarianism to a large degree, to a not insignificant degree. These are all products of the 1930s. And so the 1930s is a very complicated decade, because on one hand, like Matt was saying, you have for the first time in American history, a genuine mass mobilization of different interest groups, different classes, different racial groupings, different ethnicities together under the banner of the New Deal. You get the mobilization, the effective mobilization of large scale forces, mass politics. And in fact, we still today talk the language of mass politics, even though in my opinion, we actually as masses and as individuals don't actually have much say. And one of the reasons that we don't have much say is because of the transformations that occurred in the 1940s. So the 1930s are this great moment of mass mobilization organized under the banner of the New Deal and to some degree within the Democratic Party itself, and initiates this very epochal shift in the Democratic Party and slowly away from the Dixiecrats, who eventually leave in the 60s. But that's a story for another day. But in response to this mass mobilization, you have a critique of mass politics amongst the elite. And the elite is scared of mass politics for a number of reasons. One, it of course threatens their own prerogative. But two, they often read the experience of American mass mobilization in light of what was going on in Europe. What's going on in Europe? You have the rise of fascism in Italy and in Nazi Germany, of course. And, these are read as these mass movements that have an enormous impact a negative impact on world history. And even the Soviet Union, probably incorrectly, is understood as a society, at least at that point, that is partially run by masses. So you have an elite counter-reaction to the mass mobilizations of the 1930s. And you could, I think, usefully see in the late 1940s Truman as representative, maybe not personally, but the people around him and the people who are supporting him are representative of that anti-mass politics impulse, whereas Wallace is very much someone in favor of those mass political formations, as Matt was talking about. So it's really in the 1940s and through that creation of the American state, then what it means to be a Democrat, not, Democratic Party, but a literal Democrat in the United States undergoes a transformation. So if you think about where in the 1930s, to be a Democrat was to be someone who believed in social democracy, economic democracy, cultural democracy, and political democracy. By the 1940s and early 1950s, democracy gets defined down to political democracy and specifically the act of voting. And I think you need to understand that defining down of democracy to the act of voting, putting that in dialogue with the public-private partnership that begins to define the American state as the moment where the United States became, in a genuine sense, an anti-democracy, a society organized around limiting the masses' impact on politics and the individual citizens' impact on politics.
And I think the reason that you can point to this as a crucial hinge point, and you can imagine alternatives, is that with the death of FDR and the ascension of Truman, you do not see this grassroots movement that we've described just give up the fight. There is, in the late 40s, a significant battle on behalf of this working class movement to assert themselves in the political domain, to apply pressure and to redefine politics. And they are, over the course of the late 40s, defeated by the political system and by the people, quote unquote, in terms of the people who showed up for the 1946 midterms, for example. But of course, that's always going to be slanted towards the most prosperous end of the demographic, the people who are least materially committed to socialism. But there is an actual effort, but because it cannot be harnessed from the White House, because it cannot be directed from the heights of the state apparatus, it fizzles. So throughout World War II, the majority of unions in the country observed a no-strike pledge because they were all on board with the New Deal, whether you were a business unionist, AFL type, or a secret communist in the CIO, you believed it was in the greater good to bottled up internal dissension to help win the war, help beat the communists, or help beat the Nazis, help save the Soviet Union. It was worth putting off all labor conflicts. And of course, there were a few violations of that, mostly about race and integration of munitions factories like in Detroit and Baltimore. But after the war, the lid of the kettle explodes, and there is a massive, unprecedented to this day, wave of strikes, militant confrontations with capital throughout the country in the late 40s. And this strike wave is eventually muffled and suppressed by the failure for any other element of the social order to connect to the struggle. And this is why, if you imagine that Henry Wallace is president with a huge eruption of strikes after the war, it's much easier to imagine a situation where the leverage of the state going in on behalf of the strikers changes the dynamic. But as it was, Truman mostly let these strikes die on their own. There was an attempt to nationalize the U.S. steel industry later in the early 50s during the Korean War, which the Supreme Court struck down and which everyone just accepted. They accepted the rule of that bourgeois institution. But without that connection to the state structure and the political system, the strike wave was broken.
And that raises really interesting questions about whether you have the turn to consumption that begins to define American capitalism in the late 1940s and early 1950s if Wallace is there and he supports the strikers. Because like you said, Truman allows these strikes to die off. But I think he also, the gambit of the American ruling class and capital, particularly when the United States controls, 50% of world production after Europe commits suicide, is that they're going to replace the frontier, that masculinist frontier, with American consumption. And America is literally going to extract and consume the world. So I'm curious, what do you think? Because it's an open question. If Wallace is in there, do we have a different turn in the consumptive politics of the U.S.?
So when we reached the final crisis of that post-war consumptive arrangement in the 70s, the liberal that we had at that point in charge, Jimmy Carter, who had gone through the continuation of the process that began with the death of Roosevelt, is at this point a totally moralistic liberal, completely unmoored to any class concepts whatsoever, who decides that he's going to be straight with the American people, tell them they can't consume as much as they did and that they should find meaning elsewhere, even though he is giving them no hope of finding any meaning in the actual conditions of their labor, which is like their defining human condition. And of course, given the option of the option of Ronald Reagan's Hollywood bullshit about an endless consumer utopia based on cutting taxes, they chose door number 2. Of course they did. But I don't think that's the same situation that you see in 1945, where the American public at that point had experienced nothing but, for the last 2 generations, privation, misery, and trauma. And you had millions of American men coming home from a traumatic experience that no one you can think of, if you're listening to this, probably can compare to. Something that none of us growing up have ever had anything like. The kind of trauma of experiencing World War II at the end of a gun, just beyond comprehension. And they were coming home having believed they won something. But what that thing was up for grabs. They were not coming home demanding it be a quarter acre in the suburbs and a TV dinner and Sullivan show. They were not clamoring for that. That's what they got, because the people who were in a position to make these grander decisions and set these agendas that people can then respond to were all opposed to anything other than that, who were fixated on creating this extraction machine that would be just a giant drill into the heart of the world, sucking everything else out of it, turning it into this military machine to dominate the space, and then this place for people to just mindlessly consume.
And just very quickly, it's not for nothing that, the Anthropocene, which is a concept that I might have some issues with, but generally the starting date is pointed to the early 1950s, when basically human-caused climate change begins to genuinely shape all of the world.
Because this is where capitalism makes a deal with not just America's, but every government on Earth, that you will not have control over production as people, as workers. You will have the ability to consume. Khrushchev is often castigated for his churn to the consumer economy after World War II, but he had no choice. The choice had been for Stalin to continue the war. And as soon as Stalin decides that he is going to sign this armistice, the way that the American working class signed an armistice at the exact same time with capital in the United States, then you have to fight them on the terrain of consumption, because now you're in an arms race. You will be taken over unless you build this machine of death, which is dead labor that cannot be recuperated in the community, that does not give social value. You are committed to this. And that means that you are committed to extracting surplus labor from the workers, which is alienated from them and that undermines their faith in the system they live in, communism, and that can only be assuaged with consumer choice, the same way we have in the United States. But all of that starts in Washington, and all of that starts with Truman picking a side, committing the states to that side, and then dictating to these millions of Americans who had a very wide idea of what this thing they'd won would be, a very narrow notion. It's going to be consumption, pleasure, capitalism, and if you don't like it, you're a fucking communist and we'll fucking kill you. You will not have anything. And with that option, people chose the most logical, rational thing. If you have Wallace in there and you have this state contest with capital, I think these same traumatized troops coming home are going to experience that question as a live one, not as something dictated to them. Like, oh, we actually get to choose what we fought for, what this was worth. And I think they would choose, if they had a state reinforcing it and giving them a thing to do to support it at every moment, instead of just a state happy to let capitalism just define happiness through mass culture without any intervention, they would choose to have more control over their lives.
And I think that's absolutely true, especially when you consider that World War II was a paradigmatic mass experience. That when you're, fighting in the Ardennes forest, or you're traipsing through Western Germany, or, you land on D-Day, or you're in southern Italy, you're relying on the person next to an incredible degree, where that person becomes more than your brother. They become, a literal extension of yourself. So one of the great puzzles of modern history is how that incredible mass experience wound up producing the equally incredible American individualism of the 1950s. If you think, the paradigmatic experience of the 40s for a lot of young men was sitting with your brothers in arms, and compare that to the paradigmatic experience of the 50s, which is driving on the interstate highway system in your extractivist automobile, it's a totally different world.
There was a legitimate anxiety among the political class in the United States in the late 40s about what to do with the veterans. They were considered a scary live wire. Like, people were remembering like the fucking the Putney debates, and the levelers. Like, you've got these trained soldiers now coming back to America with certain demands for their sacrifice. And there actually were several instances. One of the most prominent, I believe, was in Tennessee, of a local political machine being resisted by returning veterans who were no longer happy to just let, the machine do the work. They wanted to be in charge of their lives politically. And the local sheriff-led political machine rigs an election, and these local veterans get their fucking guns and go to town square. And they end up forcing a new round of voting and like an overthrow of the local power. The fear that could be extended not only to politics, but to labor relationships was genuinely haunting to the planners after the war, and getting people into quarter-acre lots in the suburbs with amenities and a big fucking Buick was incredibly important. And that's why you see this rolling out of the red carpet to the American working class, the white American working class at this point, because anything to give people somewhere else to put their focus. Because if it's relatively easy and intuitive to pursue a political mobilization after the war, if it makes sense to you and your friends to keep fighting domestically for something, if it feels worth it to do, you'll keep doing it. But if there's nothing, if there's no social signal that you should do that, if every social signal tells you that you should actually buy a house and watch TV and forget about everything that happened, just forget about all that stuff. It's okay, you can. You'll be eating a burger in your on your grill. You won't be thinking about your friend's fucking guts blown over half of the city of Monte Cassino. You don't have to worry about it. You can just vibe out. Don't worry. And so you see this massive explosion in white working class standard of living. But that is what defines the political terrain of America since then. And so by the 70s, you don't have this like raw live wire population that like is willing to sacrifice for something that matters. You have people who have never sacrificed for anything, and whose relationship to the state and to the system and to capitalism is one of a happy, well-fed beneficiary. So how can they politically mobilize against a rearranging of the political economy? They can't. It happens behind their back. And then they get to choose a fairy tale to tell themselves about what just happened. And of course, they chose Reagan's.
And then I think, first time as tragedy, then as farce. With today, people are play acting the revolutionary moments of the past with things like January 6th and whatnot. And one of the reasons that I'm not worried about this is because they're actually not veterans. And like you said, they are just the beneficiaries of capitalism in a real way, and wouldn't die for any political project, because they don't really believe in any political project. And I think that's been demonstrated. And one thing that's always, struck me about the veterans is that the people who couldn't, amalgamate themselves to the society, do things things like form the Hells Angels, form motorcycle gangs, adapt this hyper-nihilistic politics that prefigures the nihilistic politics that I think have become ever more popular in the last 15 or 20 years. And just speaking of fear of veterans, the first modern serial killer, the famous Walk of Death, was a veteran, and this was Howard Unruh, I believe a soldier of German descent from New Jersey, was the first modern serial killer, and people could look up the Walk of Death. It's a tragic but interesting story that says a lot about what people's anxieties and fears were in the late 1940s. But I think we should conclude on another important moment that I also think would have been different under Wallace, and that's the Korean War. So I think it's important to underline that the Korean War is really what gives the Cold War the money that it needs. Before the Korean War broke out, a man named Paul Nitze oversaw the creation of a document called NSC 68, National Security Council Document 68, which effectively called for massive funding of the Cold War. That frames the battle with the Soviet Union as this existential Manichaean struggle and argues that the United States needs to fight this Cold War.
And removes the mechanism for funding that war from democratic consideration.
Exactly. So it's really the institutionalization of the Cold War. But importantly, this document actually doesn't go anywhere until the Korean War breaks out in June 1950. And Truman decides to really go balls to the wall in the Korean War. And between 1950 and 1953, the United States and, leading a UN force, a United Nations force, essentially pursues the most barbarous, at least in terms of per capita casualties, war of the 20th century, more barbarous than World War II and more barbarous than Vietnam. There are 3.5 million Korean casualties. And what the Korean War does, famously referred to as the Forgotten War, but what it does, it essentially puts the United States on the Cold War track for good. The Cold War is institutionalized, both in terms of the state formations that we were talking about and also in terms of the security commitments that the United States is going to make. The United States is going to fight a ground war in Asia. That was unimaginable in a real way before World War II. And of course, then it goes into Vietnam and what some historians have called the Cold War's killing fields. Paul Thomas Chamberlain in particular has called Asia the Cold War's killing fields. And I do think if Wallace was in there, I don't think he would have committed troops to Korea. I think that would have been viewed as an imperialist war. And so if Wallace is not in there, then you essentially don't have the institutionalization, the securitized institutionalization of the Cold War, the thing that really gets the military-industrial complex going and really makes Americans ready, that they're prepared to fight a series of wars after World War II. World War II wasn't the war to end all wars like World War I was supposed to be. It was never framed that way because American hegemony always depended on these types of military interventions that were defined in the Korean War. And I think, at least, Matt, I don't know what you think, but I don't think Wallace would have gone into Korea.
Absolutely. I mean, for one thing, the Korean War was not a feckless invasion by the North of the South as it's depicted. It was a provocation of the U.S. and the South Korean puppet government that we controlled to get the North to invade. Now, Truman wasn't directing this. Truman didn't want this to happen. But the structures that he had created in his signing of all these national security memos, the creation of things like the CIA, meant that the deep state, this is now being created, and now is operating independently of any democratic consideration, and that means without his authorization, because he is at the end of the day, he's only there because he won an election. And so he is going to have a limited ability to influence the decisions of these people. And so this new national security state makes a effort of pushing back against communism wherever they see it, of provoking border areas. And this is a border area where their provocations got what they wanted. And then they got to have their war to set their predicate for their coming Cold War. I don't think Wallace, as we were talking about, creates those things in the first place. And so you don't have that happening. Hell, you probably have a communist Korean peninsula. And of course, that's horrifying to imagine because, my God, then you're imagining all of Korea is terrible North Korea, Juche slave camp. But what we're really trying to say here is that if that happens, you don't have a Cold War as we understand it. You have essentially Kautsky and Bernstein's dream, which is a reform of capitalism into socialism, essentially because in this world, there's nowhere else for capital to go. There's nowhere for capital to flee to resist these state machines of Western democracy and of the Soviet Union. There's no place for capital to decisively influence things if those machines are both controlled by these working class movements. Now, you could argue that by this point, the Soviet Union is now led by sort of a deformed bureaucratic state that is created this new class that is not capitalist, but is also not working class. And that's true, but there are still no capitalists. Like, the money is being reinvested. There is no capital being accrued in the Soviet Union.
And that also raises a critical question of what if Wallace is in there? What is the Soviet Union allowed to do? Does the Soviet Union, does it not have to pursue an arms race? Is it able to pursue an actual working class communism after Stalin dies in 1953? Is Khrushchev able to do a lot of different things? So the critical thing to understand is just the sheer power of the United States on a global scale after 1945 makes these parochial domestic political choices, political processes of world historical importance in a way that they wouldn't be otherwise. And the big question, if the Soviet Union isn't forced to fight this war with the United States, I mean, personally, I think the Soviet Union, after Stalin died in 1953, there was a 2 to 3 year period where one could have made a genuine peace with them. If the Soviet Union doesn't have to fight the United States, what becomes of that project?
You know, Beria basically wanted to buy out the Soviet Union in exchange for a Marshall Plan. But the thing is that even if he had pursued that and not been cooed by Khrushchev, the U.S. would never have taken yes for an answer. The Soviets sought Marshall Plan aid. They sought entrance to NATO. People might not know that, but the Soviet Union expressed interest in joining NATO, which, of course, obviated the whole point of NATO, so they ended up creating the Warsaw Pact. But I think that the control the party had at that point over the Soviet Union, I think, was significant enough that they could have initiated a rapprochement with the West that would have had no internal resistance, for the simple fact that it would have meant a rising standard of living. Like, what this would have been the redistribution of capital, like intensification, outward, instead of the concentration of it all, like surplus basically being distributed through the system as opposed to hoarded in the United States. Now, what that would have meant is that the U.S. capital, standing in for world capital at this point, would have resisted. And I think if I try to imagine what a Wallace presidency means, I don't think it means that you get, eventually this peaceful transition. I think what you get is a deep, violent struggle for power in the United States that intensifies over the 50s and 60s. And then when the early 70s hit and the ability for capitalism to persist in a democratic milieu becomes attenuated, because as the cost of energy basically is priced into capitalism, the ability to hoard surplus goes away. And that means that the place for capital goes away. Its inefficiencies must be seized by the people, and that will be resisted. And I think that you would still have a defining moment in the 70s the way we did throughout the Western world, but it would have gone the other direction.
And then this also raises the crucial question. If, let's say, you don't have all those nuclear anxieties, which a lot of psychic energy goes to in the 1950s, which is basically a product of the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Everyone and their mother is, ducking under desks. They're freaking out. People are talking about building like gigantic underground cities so that 100,000 of the best Americans could survive this nuclear conflagration. And just a lot of psychic energy is, I think, channeled toward the essential, useless vortex of nuclear anxieties. So what if those anxieties aren't channeled there, but they're able to be, put in class conflict? They're able to be put in the class conflict that had been really gestating since the 20s and, went into overdrive with the 1930s.
That's absolutely the deal, is that in the 50s you have this steady hum of anxiety that the world is going to end at any moment, and that can only be sublimated into consumption. That's the only place it can go. But like the idea of nuclear annihilation, that is just the cultural symbolic language of a deeper anxiety about where your society is headed. An awareness that this thing cannot last forever. An awareness that you are killing the earth. Like, we know that. We can only accept it and process it through acceptable cultural symbols and language. And the symbols and language we got through the 50s and 60s was nuclear annihilation thanks to the goddamn communists. And if you have that same anxiety powering you through the 50s and 60s, but it is wedded to an understanding of capital-led ecological collapse through exploitation, then that means that all that energy, instead of going into buying a new hi-fi and cheating on your wife and eating 5 tons of red meat a night, goes into going to your union hall and standing a picket line and maybe picking up a goddamn gun. And that I think is something that would significantly shift the flow of the river of history and make the 70s moment a moment of true existential reckoning, where working class people, self-aware of their class and its historical destiny, seize control of the means of production.
Instead of credit exploding and houses becoming the vehicle of investment for the American middle class. Well, thank you everyone for listening to this week's Hinge Point. We'll be back next week and look forward to speaking with you then. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Hinge Points. And this is going to be a spicy one because we're going to analyze whether the Soviet Union, the revolution of 1917, the successful Bolshevik revolution, was actually a good thing for the left. So, Matt, before we get going, why do you think this is such an important thing to examine? What role do you think the Soviet Union plays, and particularly the 17 revolution, in the modern American leftist imagination?
Well, it stands as the first successful, self-consciously communist revolution in the world. It set the terms for the class struggle that carried on throughout the 20th century. And for that reason, its leaders serve as inspirations, and the leadership's tactics serve as inspirations for modern American leftists who are trying to, as always, see how they can be Lenin. See how they can fill the role of the Bolshevik Party, whatever that means. It doesn't necessarily, people often make the mistake of equating Marxist-Leninism as some sort of step of procedure. It's really a analytical framework for understanding the question of strategy as events unfold. How to apply Marxism, basically. And Lenin absolutely applied Marxism correctly. From the assumption that he was acting as a key member of a global communist movement that was about to take power in Europe, and it was filling out the role of doing that. And so, for very good reason, he is the inspiration for millions of American leftists. And as a result, his baby, the Soviet Union, becomes, with all of its accepted and recognized flaws, the model for social relations outside of capitalism that we have to look back to for inspiration. So it's like a key psychic element of leftism ever since.
Yeah, and it's also with Lenin that you get literally an individual, and we'll talk about this a bit more, but it's literally an individual who changes history, who moves the wheel.
This is what makes the 17 Revolution so particularly fascinating. We're talking about hinge points in the context of a process whereby the class contradictions within capitalism inside Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century reach a critical point in the early 20th century, which leads to this mass explosion of violence between the capitalist nation states of Europe. And that resulted in the emergence of working class political movements in these countries who then had to respond to the events as they played out. Now, we've talked on this show about how in Germany and in England and France, the developed capitalist countries where Marxist theory was born and where everyone operating was assuming was meant to reflect the circumstances of, meaning this is where everyone assumed that the communist revolution would start, the working class movement splintered on the question of war, and largely at its political wing acceded to participating in a bourgeois world war. by 4 years of carnage and misery and bloodshed, unprecedented and mechanized in a unprecedented way in Europe, violence not seen since the 30 Years' War, and yet more horrible still because of the intervening centuries of industrial machinery, of the refinement of the industrial machinery of war. And in that context, that working class organization sharpened into a conflict with the state. And in Germany, it failed. In France and in England, it barely even cohered, really. You had general strikes and mutinies in the army, but you never really had a conflict, a revolutionary situation develop.
Because they won the war. They certainly not won the war, yeah.
Right. And certainly not in the United States. Victorious and on the other side of the ocean and untouched by most of the trauma of the war itself, there was no conflict with the state. In the place where conflict with the state reached the point of successful revolution was the last car in the train, the caboose of European capitalism, Tsarist Russia, which had lain at the other end of the European engine of capitalism, which was built in its far western edges, in the Low Countries and England, and then exported essentially at the barrel of a gun to the rest of Europe, as the other economies of Europe were forced to incorporate capitalism into their nation states in order to compete with one another. And that was the same dynamic that forced the modernization of Russia away from its feudal peasant social structures at the same time that capitalism is reaching full development in Western Europe. So when the war came, a person like Lenin could cohere around himself a group of disaffected members of all parties, bourgeois, landowners, and workers, into this sphere of Marxist praxis. And we've talked how crucial it was to the destiny of the working class movement in the world that the revolution failed in Germany. But in the episode that we did about it, we concluded that question is not terribly contingent. It's overdetermined in a lot of ways. It's difficult to imagine the German Revolution succeeding. But with the Russian Revolution, this thing that set the course for a class conflict over the next 100 years, the success of the endeavor is much, much more contingent, because so much of it comes down to the individual person of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, of Lenin, whose absence from the scene on St. Petersburg, when you look at where the rest of the party was, the Bolshevik party, during the crisis months after the February Revolution, there is no momentum within that structure to push as decisively for power as it ended up doing. It was Lenin's arrival on Moscow at the Finland station that began to cohere the idea in the Bolshevik party that power was up for grabs, that they could take it, and that they should take it. And all of those ideas were synthesized out of Lenin and Trotsky's desire to be at the hinge point of history, basically. Like, they saw this as the moment of global class struggle, and therefore their fight in Russia would be part of a general fight across Europe. And under those assumptions, they were correct. They made all of the right decisions. That is why Lenin is revered. It's just jaw-dropping, his ability to examine the moment, where the weaknesses of the other side were, where his strengths and weaknesses were, and apply it. Now, there were failures and mistakes, and at one point during the period between February and October, he had to flee to Finland in a fake beard. But it was his reappearance in Moscow after the Kornilov affair that stiffened the spines of the other Bolshevik Central Committee members and pushed towards a confrontation with a state that really only Lenin could see was completely hollow.
Right, and completely winnable, that this was something that could actually be done.
Yes.
And this is what I think is really interesting, thinking from a more macro perspective, is that I think you and I would agree most of the times, like you talk about, and you and Chris talk about on Hell of Presidents, it's the structure that's more important, and the individual is there, but it's really the structure that's driving history. But in certain cases, the ones that immediately come to mind are really Napoleon and Lenin, much more so than Hitler, which we might want to talk about at some point. But like Napoleon and Lenin are really turning the wheels of history in a way that I think few people are.
Because they're operating in contexts where capitalism is not fully developed.
Right.
Because when capitalism shows up, it literally leeches human agency out of every action as complexity increases, as the technologicalization of decision-making increases. So you have to go back, and the farther back you go, the more embodiment and power an individual can have. And Lenin is really the last one to be able to do this.
The more agency, which is why... Which is precisely why I think you've made this point to me. I'm not sure if you made it in public. I'm sure you have. Why James Cameron is the perfect embodiment of a Lenin or a Napoleon, because the only place that someone is able to exert that sort of agency, moving grand people around on a map, is the director of a $1 billion movie franchise.
Exactly. Like all those decisions about the real economy are automized, which means we at the very top of power and the nexus of power and money, you basically are just fucking around one way or the other in some field or another.
Right. This is why they're all going to space, because this is where they feel that they could do things, not on Earth.
If you have like a real burning creative drive, that has to be channeled into spectacle and art, because there is no way to create the world anymore. The world has been shaped. So if you want to, marshal an army of people to your specific commands and exert your will on a grand canvas, you have to make movies.
Right.
So James Cameron is our Lenin, and he is our Napoleon.
Right, because you have to create worlds outside of the real world, because the real world has already been created and the algorithm has become conscious. But before we move on to the actual revolution and why it's important for the international left, one thing that I wanted to point out as I was just thinking about this episode is that I don't think it's a mistake that, we went into this wanting to focus on left-wing history in particular, that I think 3 of the episodes take place between 1914 and essentially 1921, because this is the moment when feudalism truly ends. It's on the ropes for 150 years, begins the first
uprooting of people from land.
Right.
That had been the defining structure of all political economies before capitalism has been that the grassroots of all economic activity are carried out by people who have a direct relationship to the land as cultivators in one form or another, slave, serf, yeoman. They are on the land in a fixed and permanent way. And capitalism rips that out over the course of the 20th century. And it is the assertion of capitalist social dominance in the struggle of the early 20th century that allows them to do that. For the first time wield in Europe, in Western Europe anyway, to wield these fully atomized, liberalized subjects. And I would say that one of the reasons that the Bolsheviks won and that Lenin was able to be at the right place at the right time and make the right decisions is because you were dealing with a place where feudalism was basically still operative.
Right. And this is the crucial point. So this is like, as Marxists, quote unquote, this is the crucial point, because what does this indicate about the theory that it happened in precisely where it shouldn't have happened? I mean, there are certain writings toward the end of Marx's life where he's like, oh, maybe Russia,
Yeah, the mirror looks good.
Yeah, exactly. Like maybe something will happen there. But it's such a contradictory revolution because it's led, as always, by the intellectuals of the cities, the urbanites, et cetera, in this largely peasant society that is just less developed, less modernized than the rest of Western Europe, and particularly Germany, which is where the revolution was supposed to happen and where it didn't happen. So what do you think that indicates about Marxism, like actually existing Marxism as it proceeded in history?
I would say that Marx's analysis of capitalism's accumulating contradictions is 100% accurate. I would say to the point of teleology, because I believe that he's nailed
been proven right.
all the big stuff. And for so long, people pointed to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as a fundamental failure of Marxism. And now we can see with our fucking eyes, you were just moving surplus around as you fully capitalized the world and created new markets and uprooted the last people who were outside of capitalism's cone and introducing them into capitalism. Yeah, you were able to move enough money around so that in its cultural centers, profits accumulated, but the whole time there's a cyclical arc that we are now caught in because we've created a fucking global market. But what that schematic missed, and he was aware of this, but the guy was trying to define an entire philosophy and heuristic for understanding the world to replace like our Christian notions.
To Christ, like Aristotle in Christ. Yeah,
exactly.
He did a pretty good job.
He's gonna not be able to keep all of the fucking plates turning. And that's
85% is pretty good. Yeah,
yeah, and that's the stuff that we have to figure out. Living after he does. And what happens is that as capitalism accumulates contradictions. At its geographic center, at its metropole, within any state structure, because we're talking about national capitalism's developing before the international capital develops, not only are you creating a cycle of exploitation and proletarianization, you are also creating culture. You are also building mental antibodies, basically, to class consciousness that are interacting with all of these things, directing the energies unleashed by alienation, people being pulled from the land into wage relationships, and then being exploited in those relationships, losing the autonomy, a fundamental autonomy that comes from knowing that you can make your own food.
Right.
Then the idea that there is no subjection that can be total to you because you can exert autonomy as a producer.
Right. There's no outside anymore, basically. There's no outside.
There's no outside. That is vast and monstrous, but it's not all going into the building of class consciousness and class conscious political and economics, class conscious economic, cultural, and political structures. It's also going into the monoculture that's being created superstructurally by this national capitalism, which means things like nationalism,
right,
which develop in the 19th century prior to the emergence of class consciousness, that is lower in the structural bedrock than worker, the concept of worker. Those things interact. Language, religion, like these things all interact. And then just the search for status within a social organism, the search for status and in a competition for resources created by the structure of capitalism. That builds subjects who are going to, some of them become class conscious workers, but by no means a necessary or a sufficient percentage of them. As, this is the third thing, as technology accumulates and the technology of control adheres to these capitalist superstructures and are able to assert an independent power that has nothing to do with the formal levers of control of social order that accumulate to capital. This is self-perpetuating. This is levels of latency removed from transactions to the point where machinery is not just doing the job of producing economically, it's producing culturally, it's producing consciousness. And that is something that the working class movement has to contend with. And they tried, and in Germany, they created a working class counterculture with structures of cooperative associations and schools and gymnasiums and theaters and shooting clubs and sports clubs, all the stuff we associate with civil society, but all of it arranged around their identity as workers. Like that's how it's supposed to work. But at the top of this pyramid, you're accumulating these positions of authority, influence, and power that are living lives outside of the experience of being a worker. They have in their mind an idea that they're part of a working class movement, whatever the fuck that means, but they're living bourgeois lives.
Right.
And those are the places where all of the actual authority and power accumulate, is to bourgeois people who live as bourgeois within a working class counterculture and counter hegemony. And that means that when real crisis moments accumulate, like 1917, they will use their overawing power and influence within the structure to direct the flow of the energies of the working class towards, say, imperial war and away from class war. And in Russia, those structures basically didn't exist. You had a vast array of peasants. You had an incredibly thin strip of middle-class people who in civil society and the bureaucracy. And then you had this purely parasitic aristocratic class who insisted on doing a lot of those bureaucratic jobs that had been farmed out to meritocrats in the rest of Europe 50 years earlier.
Right. Underdeveloped, yeah.
Underdeveloped structures. So that when World War I starts, it is literally up to a half-wit, inbred nitwit, an imbecile in the form of Nicholas II, who is holding power that in the rest of Europe is disseminated into bureaucratic structures that are governed by merit. Because this is the point where merit is still driving liberalism. It has not
And just-
extinguished itself.
Just very briefly, I think it's important to underline that when Matt says technology, he's referring to literal technology, but also technologies of control like bureaucracies,
Exactly.
Institutions, capital institutions, and Russia is
Vocabularies.
Right, vocabularies, languages, things like that. A mechanism for controlling what is an increasingly complex capitalist society. And what's happened is that Russia doesn't have those equivalences. Maybe it has a little bit, it echoes it in areas of Moscow, but not like the rest of the enormous imperial space. And just to underline, Matt, what you just said, I think what you're effectively saying, and this is an interesting problem for the left in general down to today, is that class is read through nation. And it's not a surprise that a lot of, the singular communist revolutions, whether you're looking at Russia/Soviet Union to Vietnam to China, occur in places where nationalist movements don't have the coherence that they do in areas of Western and Central Europe. There are elites that do it, and in Europe it's also an elite thing, but it's just such a more concentrated space that I think you're able to have differences in nationalisms. And that's why it's like in the global South, or what was called the Third World during the Cold War, or what was called in the time war area, I believe, the backward peoples is the language that was used. It's why so much of communism actually happened there. So you have this contradiction where Marx, I think you are right, basically gets everything right, but the political reality of it, due to the strength of nationalism and imperialism in Western and Central Europe, leads it to happen elsewhere in spaces that weren't, as at least according to Marx's theory, as conducive to it.
It's basically Marxism meeting the chaos theory of unfolding reality.
Yeah.
Like you create unintended consequences that cannot be accounted for. Unknown knowns, as Donald Rumsfeld
Friend of the pod,
referred
Donald
to them.
Rumsfeld said, yeah.
Yes. So that is why you could have people in Russia who, even though Marxism plainly told them that Russia was going to have to go through a capitalist stage of development before it could become communist, which to me is indisputable. This is, and you see why that was in there and in the theory when the Soviets actually had to try to develop communism.
The 5-year plans,
you're doing a lot of shit to people that alienates them from the social order, the kind of alienation that is productive under capitalism, but is here negative and accumulates and undermines the project.
And so I think this should bring us to the thesis of this particular episode and why we think it will be spicy, is that our proposition, we suppose that the Soviet Union, the fact of communism dominating the Soviet Union and winning in 1917 was actually bad for the left, the international working class over time, which will win us no friends on certain sides of the political spectrum. But that is essentially what we're saying, is it not?
Well, for me, it boils down to this. As I said, Orthodox Marxism will tell you that Russia had to go through a capitalist stage of development. But the reality of the situation is that the global capitalist crack-up was happening while Russian feudalism was cracking up. The heads of Europe were rolling, and they might have been constitutional monarchies or something close enough for government work in the West. In the East, it was an absolutist medieval regime. And what this means is that even with Orthodox Marxism telling you, wait, the actual reality is telling you, if you're a serious-minded socialist in Russia, that you have to act because this thing is falling apart. What is your role going to be in it? And more important, and crucially, I think more important than anything, is forgetting what the Bolsheviks Central Committee wanted to do. The people in the streets wanted them to take power. The people on the streets wanted socialism in one form or another. They didn't necessarily know what that was, but the people in the cities, specifically Petrograd, more than anywhere, and the place that really mattered in a way that could only happen in a fucking feudal society, could this one city end up being that determinative, is that they had created in this city the model of a proletarian class consciousness development that Marx saw in the Western European city, where you gather up proletarianized former peasants, throw them into a city and make them live and work together. They will start comparing notes. They'll start talking to one another, and they'll start becoming militant. And in the Soviet Union, in Imperial Russia, their latent frenzied attempt to industrialize had created the largest factories in Europe at the time, with the largest number of workers living and working in the same area. No other European city compared to St. Petersburg's concentration of the working class in a place where all that cultural work and bureaucratic work and technological work had not happened. So that means that you are essentially asking these people who want to see the war end and want to see some idea of a just society imposed, that they have to wait for the bourgeois to take power and for them to impose capitalism on them. Who would accede to that? No one. They risked irrelevancy. So they were essentially forced into catching up to the urban masses of St. Petersburg. In many points in the crisis after February, you see the Bolsheviks caught flat-footed. And Lenin really, what he does by showing up when he does, is he is able to let them plan and decide to make a move that allows them to, for once, have the initiative, instead of, like what happened in the July days, being caught on the back foot and having to improvise and then inevitably being dispersed and crushed. That was when Lenin had to flee back to Finland.
Right, outmaneuvered.
And Lenin is basically saying, let's take this energy and direct it, which is why I do not think there's any way that the provisional government would have sustained itself absent a Bolshevik revolution. That's not in the cards. Kerensky and the cadets are not going to be able to reassert sovereignty or any legitimacy in the popular. They would never be able to assert popular legitimacy, given what was happening. The people wanted them to stop the war, redistribute land, all things that the middle class were constitutionally incapable of doing. So they were going to be overthrown. The only question was it going to be by the left in some form or another, or by a military coup? And because the rest of the left was completely paralyzed, because they were looking at things from an orthodox Marxist point of view and saying, we can't take over, but they were essentially paralyzed, where they were going to do is they were going to hem and haw and argue amongst each other and deny taking power and risking their lives, risking their principles, and frankly, trying to do jobs they weren't prepared to do, and wait for the army to solve the problem for them in the form of Kornilov or somebody else. So that's what would have happened. But the question is, and again, this is a thing that could have happened if Lenin's has a stroke at any point, which absolutely could have happened. He had some of the worst arterial health of anyone on earth. He was just a tea kettle waiting to burst. They say that when he finally died, they did the autopsy, when the doctor used the forceps to tap his brain artery, it felt like concrete, and it made a little tinking noise.
It was like mud in there.
Yeah, this guy's not healthy. Or someone shoots him, or the train from the SEAL train derails, or the Germans just decide not to do it.
Right.
If he is not there, you have a counter reaction. And I believe Trotsky theorized that Nazism would have developed, fascism would have developed out of that, and not in Germany, which I think is very well possible. But the question before us is, so this entirely contingent event doesn't happen. Unlike any of the others we've talked about, which all of them are much more thickly determined, something changes. We're in a portal into another dimension, and there is a counter-revolutionary overthrow of the provisional government. Would that be a better or worse outcome for the class project than the establishment of the Soviet Union?
Given what we know in 2021, given the perspective,
which obviously hindsight. That's why doing alt history is great. It's Monday morning quarterbacking. You can never be wrong. But it is, I think, an interesting and useful intellectual exercise if we just understand that that's what we're doing. We are just going from the assumption that there's a better outcome than where we are now, that there is a better set of conditions than the ones we're stuck in. Now, of course, there very, 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 very easily could be much worse.
Of course. Always.
And those universes exist. But we're taking for granted here the idea that is assumed that if that happens, you have a worse situation for the left. We're saying, what is the case? What is the imagined world that can be created given the assumption that, okay, this didn't succeed.
And so I think that's interesting and important to underline that we're looking at this from the perspective of American leftists in 2021. And so we're looking at it from the perspective of a world in which after 1917, really after 1921, and as the Soviet Union solidifies itself over the course of the 20s and the 30s, as it engages in experiments that genuinely attract a lot of the Western left, there's a romanticism to early Soviet the early Soviet Union that is kind of, displaced by the Moscow trials and then, really destroyed by the doctor's plot in the 1950s. But there's a real romanticism where the Soviet Union becomes the center of international leftism. It becomes the place where the left as an ideological project begins to seriously look. And Moscow, of course, over the course of the 20th century, begins to take an ever more important role in organizing the international left. And before we get into that question, I think it's just important to give a state of play, let's say, where the American left was in 1917, 1918. So Eugene Debs in 1912 wins, I think, 12% of the popular vote, something pretty significant. I believe those are the right numbers, but is arrested toward the end of World War I. There's a lot of anti-leftist things being done by the Woodrow Wilson administration. There's the arresting of socialists and other ethnic minorities. Let's assume that the German revolutions continue to fail. Let's assume everything proceeds as it was, but the only difference is that the international leftist brain no longer becomes headquartered in Moscow. So what sorts of opportunities do you think that presents to the world where that might not have been available in the world where it actually lived, where you get, for example, a German Communist Party that is directly linked to Moscow, or various third world revolutions that are in various ways linked to Moscow? Why would that be a positive development in your view, or in what ways would it be negative? We could take both sides.
Yeah. So it is literally a trade-off, right? So the disorganized international socialist movement that had failed to create any sort of
basis for 1914, right?
Yeah, they had no preparation. They had no way to assert any prerogative beyond the national one. They broke into national sects, had the significant downside of not having headquartered executive function anywhere. And what the victory of the Bolsheviks did was give this movement direction.
Gives it a magnet. Gives it a North Star in a real way.
Right. Which is why even people who understood that the project was having difficulties and that violence was happening
had flaws, to say the least.
It was necessary for the struggle. And at that point, they were right, is the thing. Once it wins, once the Soviet Union is established, you can't pretend it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
You have to assume, okay, this is what we have, and then work from that perspective. And so many people made the correct decision that, okay, we have to now support this government and therefore, to a certain degree, transform our internationalist perspective into a national perspective, to assimilate a Russian nationalist geopolitical agenda that is separate from any of our work to spread international communism or even to perform communism in our own countries, because this is now the project. And the problem with that, the trade-off that I was talked about, is that centralization around this national interest creates contradictions.
Right. And it's also just quickly, it's a centralization which 1914 has proved in a world where there is no international, genuine working class consciousness.
Yes.
There's not even one in Europe,
right?
In Western Europe, in countries that are relatively similar to each other, let alone internationally. So that's the world that we're living in 1917.
Yeah. Right. And so when this newly centralized international, which is now the Comintern, is able to assert its power, it's doing so from a national perspective. And that means that their decision-making is going to be put through that lens. And you see the problem with that is the inability to reckon with local conditions. In the 1920s, you saw the decisions in Germany to demand that the Communist Party refuse all cooperation with the Social Democrats, and in China to encourage a urban revolt in Shanghai, both of which end up having catastrophic
not great choices. Literally catastrophic for the history of the world.
Yeah. And the rejoinder to any counterfactual musings about the failure of the Bolsheviks is often rejoinded with, well, what about the Nazis, right? What about the Nazis? Without the socialism in one country and the iron hand of Stalin, you would not have had the building up of a machine capable of defending against the the Nazi party. And that is true. That's unquestionably true. But I do wonder, in a context where counter-revolution is sort of on the march from the East, as it had been all through the 19th century, if the absence of a Soviet Union doesn't lead to the situation where the German left is capable, perhaps, of uniting in the face of like a military fascist plot, which of course is going to happen as capitalism continues its nervous breakdown all through the post-World War I period.
No, I think that's true. And I think the question that we're dancing around is like, what is like the ordinary Hans on the street do, right? Yeah. If there's not a specter of Soviet communism that always infects how random German or random Frenchman or random English person or American, I think as well, if there's not that specter there, is there a way for the nationally based left, which is not the ideal situation, but is the situation that we find ourselves in after World War I, to become a more serious threat on the domestic stage? Because I do think that one of the ways that social democratic reform, I would say the major reason in the United States at least, was literally the specter of communism. And it was used from the 1930s onward to basically prevent the genuinely radical reforms, which I do think, absent a Soviet threat or a Stalinist, perceived Stalinist threat, would have been able to be channeled in a Western context. And then moreover, beyond that, beyond sort of like taking it from the perspective of the West, what if we don't have the Soviet Union essentially picking winners in various countries around the world for their own parochial interests, their own declared parochial interests? And I think that opens up a world of possibility for things going a totally different way. The question, I think, let's speak about it in the United States, is like, does liberalism go further left? Because I don't necessarily think, absent the Soviet Union, all of a sudden Eugene Debs wins 48% of the vote. But I do think that you could have a more genuinely radical liberalism, which was sort of in the breach in the 1920s and the 1930s, because it appeared to many that, and this is, people know the critique is most familiar with Carl Schmitt, but Carl Schmitt was one of a number of people across the political spectrum who essentially argue that liberalism is feckless and that it's laissez-faire approach to things. It can't really address the crises of the age, which is mass politics and the Depression. So what if there's not a Soviet Union, could that liberalism actually embrace, instead of essentially the right-wing capitalist concordat that it made, a more genuinely left-wing alternative? And I think that's really an open question without the Soviets.
Yeah, many people point out to the fact that all of the significant, as you said, all of the significant social democratic reforms that liberalism acceded to were in the context of the threat of the Soviet model and the threat of the Soviet Union as a global competitor. And that is true. But when people make that point, they're assuming that absent the Soviet Union, there is no specter of the left. But there would be. It would just be the domestic working class movements within specific countries. It would be
scarier, actually. I think it would be scarier than an essentially made up enemy, as far as I'm
concerned. Well, as an enemy that can be othered, exactly. You've created a national base for communism, but that means that you've put in the minds of those unaffiliated regular workers in the West who have not achieved class consciousness because of all those cultural antibodies we talked to, but who are still citizens, still consuming media, still laboring, still capable of being won to a political project. For them, communism has now been associated with this country, this foreign country, and foreignness implying with all of its threats of undermining one's own position. Whereas like an international proletarian can say you have nothing to lose but your chains. A nationally fixed communism says to unaffiliated workers, we have these chains for you, this national structure with its own contradictions, which caused real violence. I mean, the Civil War was horrifyingly bloody, and yes, you can blame it on the White Army and the Allies, and that's correct. But But once again, that was the consequence of the failure of a world revolution to occur. The thing that Lenin and Trotsky essentially ruled out as a possibility in order to motivate themselves to do what they did.
Right. Which they assumed earlier in their careers, by the way.
Right.
They assumed that was going to happen, but they had to rule it out, and not incorrectly, one might add.
Because the people,
because
when you're stuck with the question that the Orthodox Marxists were stuck in as the Tsarist regime fell apart, the mediocrities are going to instinctively move towards the position of we can't do anything because they can't do anything. Anybody with any real ability is going to gravitate at the question of what can I do? What can I do now? We can seize power and it will help bring about a world revolution. And they believe it because they're capable people. Like Lenin believed it because he was fucking Lenin. Guys like you can see in the Central Committee meeting before they launched the revolution, you see there in the people who said to wait, the concentrated mediocrity of the old Bolsheviks. Kamenev, Zinoviev, these guys were the mediocre of the able, basically. And so they were afraid of doing it because they didn't have the confidence in themselves that included a confidence in a world revolution to come. But absent that, you have to fight a war, and then you have to create an industrial state capable of competing with those other industrial states who created their proletariats through a process of centuries of violence and oppression, but also the expropriation of imperial spoils elsewhere to soothe and ease the transition into the working class subject, the subject outside of connections to land that you have to create before you can create communism. You are going to have to make workers with the same tools of violence that capitalism had used, but uncloaked by capitalism's mystifications. No god of the market to put off the violence on. Just the state, the people carrying this out. And it was necessary, but it also, as it was unfolding, tainted public faith in the project in the same way that feudalism lost its ability to sustain itself as it failed to allow people to believe in the project over time and replace it with what they thought was liberation, liberal capitalism.
Right, especially because when you're talking about the Soviet Union, by the late 1930s, it's hard to defend a regime that defends like the Moscow trials. You know, I think like whatever side you're on,
and then even if you can defend the terror in the trials and the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, I think.
Oh, right, that kills it. That's the final,
the final and irrevocable nail, because you literally have organized your politics around defeating capitalism by first defeating the rabid dog of fascism, which had to be killed before capitalism could be dealt with. And here you see the state that is the headquarters of working class revolution allying with the working class's most ferocious enemy. Even if you stuck around, and again, you probably had a good reason to do so because you are committed at this point to the Soviet Union. And what do you know? They ended up being the ones really to destroy fascism. So, hey, you bet the right hand. They made the right call. Stalin made the right call. He bought himself some time, and then he was able to get these schmucks in the democracies, quote unquote, to help him hold this fucker down and kill him and put him in a position to compete for power with capitalism. Hey, it worked. But by that point, you have filtered out so many people.
Yeah, that's 20 years on, yeah.
And you have alienated fundamentally the regular, non-attached worker who you have to fight for, who you have to convince because he's been conditioned and mystified by capitalism, as everybody in all these structures do. People recoil from the idea of false consciousness because it implies that some people within these structures have real consciousness. No, false consciousness is universal within a hegemony, and everyone is seduced by it. Like, that's why you had the betrayal of the working class of Germany by the bourgeoisified fat cats of the SPD and the unions. But it exists all through society, and it has to be dealt with and struggled with. And having the Soviet Union there as the representation of world communism made it harder. And when you look at the way that the Socialist Party in the United States, which had been accumulating votes, had accumulating offices, was in a position to genuinely challenge for power locally and increasingly nationally, collapsed completely after the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, and that's because of the first Red Scare, right? You get
Right.
this huge strike wave after World War I, famously in Seattle, but elsewhere throughout the country as well. There's coal strikes in 1919. There's a Seattle General Strike in 1919. There's steel strikes in 1919. And one of the ways that capital was essentially able to organize itself against these successfully was to raise the specter of domestic Bolshevism as a genuine threat. You had people going around the country talking about it. You have the famous Palmer raids. You have a lot of deportations. And the question is, and I think this is not an open and shut case. I think there's a real argument to be made that absent literally just the very existence of the Soviet Union, the U.S. government would have been able to be so heavy-handed against a domestic threat. You think you would have been able to get a large public opinion and get against your side unless you were able to after years of anti-German propaganda. So the populace is sort of like ready to believe othering propaganda. I don't think you're able to get quite as such a. I don't think you're able to get a Red Scare essentially absent the Soviet Union.
And remember, this is a process that's happening on both sides. The state is able to impose this new level of violence by justifying itself in the name of fighting against another. But the creation of the Soviet Union splits the labor movement and splits the electoral left in two sides who either want to affirm their loyalty to the Moscow Project or to be independent of it. And that
was not good for the left.
That's an irrevocable conflict, and it shrinks instead of expands the pool of talent within the left and the potential recruits among the working class. So at both ends, it weakens the American labor movement. And while the Communist Party does emerge in the 30s as a significant force because of the degree of alienation caused by the Great Depression, they have this Moscow weight around their neck. They responded by trying to compensate really kind of in an unseemly way by overemphasizing their patriotic bona fides. Under Earl Browder, the slogan of the Communist Party was, "Communism is 21st century Americanism." And at their big rally in Madison Square Garden, they had Abraham Lincoln's head on the stage. And they had to do that because they perceived the issue with pitching a foreign idea to American workers. And that is an obstacle that wouldn't existed in the context of a general crisis in capitalism, which would have been there either way. And so if you have independent national socialist movements pushing against capitalism, I
much
think
larger because they include communists now.
Yeah. I think you do have the emergence of this fascist synthetic alternative.
Agreed.
But perhaps it's not able to effectively develop because the national question is neutralized by a politics that is emphatically class conscious. Like the specter of the national is taken out of politics absent the Soviet Union.
And then you could get the presentation of a more genuinely nationalist communism. Within the German case, I mean, it's difficult to say, does that mean Hitler doesn't come to power? I do think a united left, particularly an SPD that doesn't feel like it needs to protect against its left flank, becomes a more powerful party after 1928, the era of the Nazis' rise.
I will say this. I do not think, though, that even in my most optimistic gaming out of this scenario, that we avoid large-scale violence in the 1930s and 40s.
That was my next question. I think so. What does that look like? Because does Russia become? Is the Tsar like? Do they get like a William and Mary to come in? From Finland, someone like vaguely related to the Romanovs. Like that's also an interesting question. It's difficult for me to know because I don't know enough about Russian history. But like, what is Russia? Because Hitler's entire thing is based on expansion for Lebensraum in the East. Yeah. So is Russia become some sort of fascist aligned state? Because that could be that's a horse of a different color. That makes a different thing. But I don't know. What do you think about that? What is Russia?
I think you could see
if Lenin's brain explodes.
If not the reassertion of serfdom, I honestly think you could see a period of significant prolonged violence with massive violence to the Jews. Like not Holocaust numbers because we don't have that level of sophistication.
Yeah, no technology enough yet. Yeah.
Like one way or another, the Jews of Central Europe, The people of the Pale, they take it on the chin in the 20th century.
I'm glad my family was out of there by then.
the bill is coming due, not that the Jews deserved it, but that they had been the accumulated venting point of all capitalist-related alienation, right?
And centuries of pogroms.
And ruling class alienation, even under feudalism. They had been there to absorb all of the resentments of being a subject in post-Roman Europe. And so when the system breaks down, they're going to have to be sacrificed, basically, for some regime on the right to consecrate their power, because somebody has to pay for what happened, right? If Kornilov or whatever it takes power. So you have a massive systematized pogroms of the Jews, massive purging of the middle classes, huge emigration of the intelligentsia, but then not the reassertion of serfdom, rather an NEP style accommodation with the market and the peasantry, which would essentially sacrifice growth on the altar of stability, which would be possible because the Western allies would probably be very happy to affirm that authority in order to prevent the potential takeover of the left. And if it didn't, if it failed to cohere, you'd see some sort of land grab, I think, by Germany.
By the Western powers.
By Germany specifically, but yes, by the Western powers. There would be some attempt to carve it up the way that China was.
Right, so sort of like the late 19th century carve up.
Right.
So does that reactionary power, let's say Hitler comes to power, do they ally with Hitler in some sort of rump state?
I think it would be a relationship like he had with Vichy or something, you know.
So yes,
they would be a client. Yeah. It would be. I mean, someone is going to try to impose formal empire on this thing from a dominant position outside of the competitive framework. Someone is going to do the thing that Napoleon couldn't do, the thing that Charles V couldn't do, the thing that Charlemagne couldn't do, the thing that Suleiman the Magnificent couldn't do, and that is reaffirm dynastic power in Europe.
Which is possible in the area we're talking about because of the plains. You could actually do it. Hard to do in Western Europe. I'm not sure that's really super
the
possible.
real thing is the level of technological sophistication here means that this sort of fighting laid waste to Europe cyclically, right? The Italian wars and the 30 Years' War in Europe, like from that period, you could cycle it from the 100 Years' War. You go from the cycles of 100 Years' War to the Italian wars.
And those are the 14th and 15th centuries for everyone, the 100 Years' War.
Yeah, to the Italian wars after that, to the 30 Years' War, as this chain of struggle over dominance of Europe from a central position. And then it guttered out and then flamed back up in the guise of early liberal modernity under Napoleon. Failed again. It cannot be really done, but the technology makes it more viable each time, basically, but also more destructive each time, hypothetically. And we've reached a point in the 20th century when that sort of state violence becomes apocalyptic, even absent an atom bomb. So that is why what I think happens in this hypothetical context, or let me just say the best case scenario, because obviously we could talk about one where it's just war forever until somebody gets a bomb and then everyone gets a bomb and then everything is gone. Right. That's possible. But I'm imagining a situation where in a context of low-level imperial violence now closer, like in the empire, but also in the hinterlands, in the bloodlands, as Timothy Snyder called them, but also increasingly civil war in the nation. So instead of a nation-state contest like World War I had been, you might have seen a series of civil wars, similarly to the way that you saw a outbreak of civil wars in early modern Europe under the same crisis conditions. And in those wars, the bourgeois, broadly construed, won. Well, and that's what Marx was looking at when he was imagining the future of class conflict.
What if there's a united left? Yeah.
If that happens, then because of numbers and because of the ability of the working class to get hold of the technologies of state and culture and warfare, you could see the scales tip. within a national context under conditions of crisis, which Marx understood to be necessary for communism to succeed. So that is like the best case scenario. And even in that case, I don't think you have some generalized victory. You probably have pockets that then spin up into regional powers that then come back into conflict again with the bourgeois states more left-wing maybe, but also having, carried out this massive bloodshed. But in some states, like a real communism appearing that then has to do what the Soviets did, but in a different world, in a world where the proletarianization has been more successful and complete than it was in feudal Russia.
Right. In a world where the left hasn't been discredited by decades of association with the Soviet Union.
And of course, the left answer to this is none of that is fair. They did everything they had to do. But you're not convincing leftists. If you had to convince leftists, none of these questions would matter.
Right.
You have to you have to go through the screens of mystification. Yes, you're righter than they are. But the problem is someone's righter than you on every question. The only way we can get towards a modus vivendi of effective action is by comparing notes on the broadest possible social context, bringing together through technological communication the opinions of as many people of the same class as possible, and to then make decisions based on that collected understanding. It's not up to individual points of view.
And even within that, if you think about like actually existing history, some unions were fairly right-wing, particularly in the United States. And I think those unions wouldn't have been able to have been right-wing without that Soviet issue. Yeah. So you would have had a general drifting, I think, to the left and the embrace of certain even communist positions, particularly about planning during the era of the New Deal. I think that could have become a thing in the 40s and after in a way that it wasn't quite in the United States. So this will be our new TV show. It'll open with someone going into the train and you see Lenin dead, and this will be where we'll go from there.
Because the question of Lenin lives, Lenin doesn't die is interesting. If you can keep that mind there in the cockpit instead of giving it to people who just weren't him, but so much else has to happen in addition to him living. So many dominoes have to fall that you really are moving a mountain to try to, in your head, imagine a plausible world where those conditions can produce any other result. But if the train is empty when it gets to the station, a whole host of possibilities open, if only because it didn't happen.
Yeah, and just to underline, I think what we're saying essentially is that the existence of the Soviet Union as it actually, existed in reality, that we're understanding why it came to be, but that this did two particular things. One, by making Moscow the lodestone of the international left, and two, splitting the left in nation-state situated left into two parts that, really were vicious with each other throughout the 1920s, particularly in Germany. It would have provided for new possibilities. And I think I want to underline that we're not necessarily making value judgments per se, but just trying to game things out.
Beside the point. Like, one of the things that makes it very difficult to think about history effectively and lucidly, and one of the reasons that we're stuck in an incredibly idiotic culture war around American history that cannot be resolved and can only be used to fundraise for political scumbags, is that we instinctively understand the compiling of a historical narrative to be about judging good and bad sides and the good and bad people, and to putting ourselves in places where we can imagine that we were on the right side. But while that is a real live question in the moment when all this stuff is happening, it is only to the individuals. Now, in the rearview mirror, you have to just look at it as stuff that happened and understand that the moral decision-making matrices of every individual were individualized. And that
contextual and contingent.
Contextual and contingent. And you cannot, there's no point in judging their subjective mindset, basically. It's a question of instead finding out what they were thinking, why they were thinking it, and then applying it to the current moment.
And I think this might actually be a good place to end, because one of the major things we're trying to do in this first batch of episodes is to really, underline the importance of historical materialism. To me, this is the first commandment, which is understand your time, understand what's going on in it, understand the past, understood what was going on then, because that's the way to try to get the world in which we want to live. That's the way in order to develop strategy. And oftentimes judging the past from a value perspective, which is what we're really trained to do in the United States in modern times, occludes that. And so I think on that note, Matt, unless you have any last words, anything?
Yeah, I just want to say that people want to say, how do you get Trotskyists? This set of dilemmas that was created by the success of the Bolshevik Revolution is how you get Trotskyists. Because Trotsky was, as Isaac Deutscher called him, he was the prophet. And he was a prophet of a world revolution. And when it failed to happen, he essentially refused to make any decisions because he was waiting for the intercession of that world revolution that had to happen to resolve all the contradictions that he had in his mind dealt with. And he couldn't reassess those conditions when the world changed around him, basically. He was trapped by it because he was the one who had exponed it. Trotsky is more responsible for the Russian Revolution, I would argue, than Lenin was in many important respects. It was his theory of permanent revolution that became Lenin's justification for seizing power. It was his leadership in the Petrograd Soviet from a perspective of oratory and public speaking that galvanized huge numbers of working class Russians to rally to the Bolshevik banner. And it was his military direction of the actual seizure of the Winter Palace that made it happen from a tactical point of view. So he was like the unalloyed vision of the revolution. And that means that whereas Lenin was saved from the terrible question of what to do now by his own death, Trotsky was left in the lurch to try to make sense of everything. And he basically wanted to keep kicking the can down the road until the intercession of the Messiah, basically, in the form of a world revolution. But real people on the ground had to live real lives, and they had to make decisions in the moment. And he essentially abjured himself from power willingly. He could have taken power, but he refused to because it would have required him to do things that he was not prepared to do. And so he then fled Russia and tried to imagine this untainted working class movement that isn't led by Moscow, that is separate, that is truly international. And he became just a sad loser trying to get together a bunch of pointy-headed dorks to precisely align all of their perfect virtues together, to perfectly balance between these nasty capitalist and communist camps. And that's why they persist. But what that shows is the failure to adapt as conditions change. Right. Like once you don't have a world revolution, but you do have a Soviet Union, you have to reassess
the whole thing.
And he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. And they got to, there were two conclusions drawn from this. There was at the time, the Zinoviev, Kamenev side that basically said, we must industrialize to maintain ourselves. We need to squeeze the peasants. We need to pull them from the land. We need to impose the market on this feudal arrangement in order to compete with the West. And then you had Bukharin saying, no. The world revolution is not happening. We have accepted that. Both sides basically had accepted that premise, which Trotsky wouldn't. And so he says, in this context, we have to climb down from this. We cannot be the communist vanguard in Russia. We need to extend the NEP and essentially introduce capitalism to rural Russia. We can try to hold on to power, but we're going to fundamentally have to change who we are as a party and our understanding of Marxism. Now, I would argue that in that moment, Bukharin had the right of the question. But what matters is that both of those sides ended up getting annihilated by one guy in the room who didn't fucking care. Because the other guy who did couldn't make the choice, couldn't face reality, and just essentially let them kick him out of the country so that he could be spared the moral stain of admitting he was wrong somehow and refounding his beliefs. And one of the reasons that Stalin ends up winning and we get like the worst model for communist political economy you can imagine, and that I don't think is arguable. You can say it's worth it, but that's from a position of believing in it, which most people are not born to do. They have to be convinced and acculturated to doing it, because it was left in the hands of the people who were most willing to commit to the project of Russia rather than the project of world communist working class revolution.
That's another great hinge point, the Lenin death and Stalin, and what if it was Trotsky who took over, who was willing.
Because I think Lenin, if he'd been healthy and with it, he would have changed the contours of the debate in such a way that they could have pulled towards some different accommodation that would have maybe been more successful, because you see in Lenin the guy who was the fusion of Trotsky's idealism with the steely resolve and willingness to make the difficult but right choice
will
of
to
Stalin.
Power, frankly. In
You see the will to power in
power.
Lenin.
Yeah.
So him applying his position, his paramount influence into that question, I think creates something other than the clumsy and brutal collectivization that you got.
Well, I don't think the tankies are going to like this bad boy, but I hope people understand we approached it openly and honestly in the best way.
I just hope you get where we're coming from, because we're not the Soviet Union. Once it happens, at any point, you got to defend it. It's there. If you had been there at the time, you have to defend it. You have to assume its reality. You can't assume a fantasy world, but that's not what we're doing here. We're not living in its reality. It died. We're living in the decaying corpse of the leftist project. If something is going to challenge capitalism, it's going to be new. It's going to be different. Right. It's going to be a new project.
Nostalgia, yeah.
There's stuff to learn about all of this by analyzing it, but it cannot be engaged emotionally because it's gone. The spirit has left. It's just a corpse.
Precisely. And strategic thinking requires as objective as one can be about past events, and that requires also imagining alternatives and seeing where one might have been able to make different choices, or where different contexts might have allowed for different possibilities.
Yeah.
So on that note, Matt, thank you. Thanks, everyone, for listening to Hinge Points. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Hinge Points. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with Matt Christman. And in this episode, we're going to go over probably the most important hinge point in our life, or at least one of the top three, along with the 2008 financial crisis and maybe the actual invasion of Iraq. And of course, that means we're going to be talking about 9/11, the thing that transformed the future of American foreign policy, and even to some degree transformed how we understood the past of foreign policy. And so everyone knows the basic story of 9/11, or at least we think we know. There's a lot of unanswered questions about what exactly happened on the day itself. But, for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to assume that 9/11 happened roughly as the official story went. 2 planes flew into buildings, and the American national security state responded with 20 years of war and a counterterrorism apparatus that still defines how the United States acts in the world. So, Matt, why do you think 9/11 was such an important hinge point? And then I'll give a bit of background on what was going on before.
So when 9/11 happens, you have America, the American colossus that had inherited the world as a unipolar hegemon after the fall of the Soviet Union, at a cliche to say it, but accurate crossroads. Because while in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, George Bush had created his little Potemkin War in the Middle East as a display of American military prowess and as a renewal of America's military focused foreign policy. The next 8 years after Clinton took office are really adrift. There is this grasping for a raison d'etre for the American military state. And the closest anyone can come up with are these peripheral police actions that are meant to enforce America's role as global policemen. I mean, the reason everyone kept squawking insistently for that whole decade that we weren't going to be America's policemen and warning everybody else that we aren't going to do that is because that's all we were doing. That was the future of American empire, and that was not politically viable in the long term. America was already sick of it, and it had barely cost them anything. This continued orientation of the military state was just not sustainable. Some new enemy had to emerge.
One of the things that really jumps out to me about that is when you think about the cultural products of the late 1990s and the sort of intellectual exhaustion they represented. You have things like Saving Private Ryan. You have right before 9/11, actually 2 days before 9/11, I believe, Band of Brothers debuts. So you have this, portrayal, this baby boomer portrayal of these movies sort of hearkening back to the moment when America had a purpose. So you have, on one hand, you have the nostalgia of boomers like Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, people who, grew up with a certain idea about what the United States should do in the world, and they reflect it in these movies. And on the other hand, you have what I would call the Gen X response to that in movies like Office Space and Fight Club, which essentially are just about intellectual exhaustion and the fact that there's no meaning in the world. And so I think in some sense, the 90s could be defined as a crisis of American meaning. And what 9/11 does is it gives that meaning that was otherwise absent.
Right. So it orients our culture and our politics around this new enemy, and the confrontation of this enemy has to take the form of a military confrontation. And that means that you have the possibility here, open with 9/11, with the trauma of that, to create a situation where the United States, instead of being the policeman of a global capitalist order that was slowly decentering American interests. Like, that's the important thing to realize, is that all of America, to some degree or another, recognized in the 80s the creeping irrelevance of American power in the global world. That what we would prefer to happen is no longer going to be guaranteed by the market, because the market has now transcended a parochial American interest. It is now truly a global economic structure. America can now be one country of others deciding what to do with all these resources. And in that context, the overwhelming amount of power wielded by the United States, accounting for 5% of the world population, would eventually kind of have to be corrected for. And so there's, I think, at the highest levels of power more than anywhere, an acute awareness that something had to be done to reassert the primacy of America as headquarters of global capitalism. And that meant taking this military state that had been built up over the last half century, this unprecedented military machine that had outspent the Soviet Union into collapse and now dominated the globe, to, instead of being the police officer, the night watchman that the libertarians imagine is the sole role of the state, what if we turned our invisible empire into a physical, real, militarily enforced, geographically defined empire, and use that military power not only is to generate our economic activity, but also orient all of our politics and culture to ensure that, like, the global fight for capitalism will be this desperate scramble for resources that America will use its force to win. But all that is, you can see the path. Like, this is the only way America gets out of this terminal decline towards the reality of a multipolar world. And this is the moment where everybody at the top of the totem pole in the American state is fully committed to resisting that decline. But there is no reason to. The American public is asking all these questions about meaning, and they're looking inward, and they're looking at a social order that gives them no sense of meaning, that does not allow them any ability to have meaning, because it doesn't allow them autonomy. They cannot make their own lives. Their lives are made by the market. They can make their lives in the pseudo realm of a consumption identity fantasy. And that is, and immediately became, wildly alienating, even as people had still an assumption in that 90s glow that economically there would be a certain assumed standard of living. But is that enough? And the answer was no. 9/11 emerges at the precise moment to just break the entire American mindscape away from the self and towards the other, and to orient all of their political concerns, all of their questions about what the state should be doing around the question of defending us instead of serving us.
And I think a way to think about that is that 9/11 solves what can be usefully understood as a crisis of liberalism. Because the basic premise of liberalism, as it's initially instantiated in the 19th century and develops over the course of the 20th century, is that you're going to have increasing authority, increasing autonomy over your own life. But what happened over the course of the second half of the 20th century is that capitalism won. This element that emerges from liberalism and shapes liberalism in various ways totally won. And in its total victory with the destruction of the left wing that we talked about in an earlier episode, with its total victory of capitalism, you have this endemic crisis of liberalism. Because let's take Fight Club, where Edward Norton's character doesn't have autonomy at work, right? And so it has the focus of the tyranny of work or office space, which is essentially the exact same plot, is that these, the subject of history, these white male Americans feel like they don't have autonomy. And so you have a gestating and genuine crisis of liberalism, which, was also happening in the 1930s and 1940s. And it was cut off by World War II and the Cold War back then. And in post 9/11, that crisis of liberalism was at least cut off for 15 years. I think the big difference between the 30s and the 40s is that Nazism, one could read as a genuine existential threat, at least to certain ideas of what the United States wanted itself to be in the world. The Soviet Union, I think, less legitimately, but, it was a great power with a lot of nuclear weapons. It's not totally crazy to see it as an existential threat, even though I thought it was. But Islamic terrorism just wasn't in any meaningful way. So you have, unlike in the Cold War, which really did cut off the left and cut off the crisis of liberalism, you have the return to it in particularly the election of Donald Trump, but also the ascent of Bernie Sanders, which are both offering two different solutions to the crisis of liberalism and the crisis of American autonomy. And so 9/11 is what I mean to say. It's interesting because it is a genuine hinge point, but the problem is the structures as they exist today aren't able to offer that sort of alternative that they were in the 30s and the 40s.
Yes, and we are in the wake of these events now, because there is no working class based counter hegemonic structures that can see an event like 9/11 or anything that happens afterwards and use it to advance their own independent agenda. Instead, the agenda of capitalism, broadly defined, is then manifested through its cultural structures and then absorbed by a public that is at this point so cut off from the self-conception of one as a worker or a member of a class, and so oriented around the idea of one as a consumer and an expression of identity through consumption. All they could do is attach one way or another to this new grand narrative that they could only observe and not really do anything about, other than take all of the anxiety and alienation that comes from having no control in this situation and venting it towards some other that they wanted to see destroyed. And for a little bit in that the post 9/11 glow, there was really national unity. And when people say that, what they're forgetting to add is that it was national unity against an other. And it was all oriented around defining this new enemy that had emerged out of nowhere, really, because no one really was paying attention, and now challenged our very ability to live, our ability to survive as individuals and as a society. And that is where our unity came from. And that was the bipartisan consensus, because that was the state's preferred response that we have in that moment, which is to look outward, to find an enemy, and then give the planners the clear runway to enact what I think otherwise would be a highly objectionable agenda, which is, hey, let's not make a peace dividend and give people universal health care and things like that. Let's instead level the Middle East and become its new lords on earth. People would say no, absent 9/11. So it fulfills every demand. And it's a hinge point because it's so hard to imagine. Let's say 9/11 doesn't happen. Somebody decides to frisk Muhammad Atta, or somebody else gets arrested, and some local cop who's not in on it is like trips the alarm. And there's a bunch of ways 9/11 couldn't have happened. I don't know if you could get away with there not being some massive attempt, in the early aughts. But if it's not successful, if you don't have the spectacular collapse of the towers, I am really at a loss to figure how the hell can America's rulers manage that process because it would be decline in every respect of American power.
And all the cultural products were very clear about that, particularly for young men. And I think that's also really crucial to understanding what's going on. So this is, of course, the first Hinge Point that you and I were alive for. And we were, young men consuming Office Space, South Park, Fight Club. All of those movies were probably movies that you loved. I certainly did at the time. So I was curious, and thinking about Hinge Points, maybe going down a little bit from the macro political and economic level, was this a hinge point in your life? Did 9/11 change how you understood things as a young man growing up in Wisconsin?
It's hard to, it's those things come into your life and you just, it's so hard to think of a world without them that it's hard to really weigh what it's responsible for. I think it definitely shaped me. I think it pulled me inward in a way. And I think it definitely broke off my horizons. Like I was already kind of at that point a recently traumatized kid, going to college and all that. But man, that really didn't help. And I do feel like there is a turn inward that then manifested itself by people seeking escape, either in political fantasies of violence that they could vicariously enjoy or theaters of distraction that ended up consuming a whole generation.
For me, it was really interesting because I was in New York. I was from New York, and then I wound up going to college in New York. And to be honest, it did feel like it gave some direction to my life. Like it did feel in those first years, I was 16 when 9/11 happened, and I was in college, 17, 18, 19. It did feel like there was a genuine mission in the world that was analogous in meaningful ways to the mission of World War II. And I think in some sense, I don't know if you feel the same way, but like consuming all of those late 90s cultural products, particularly Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, really got me pumped up on the idea of American hegemony and American power. And with 9/11, it did seem like there was a way to meaningfully orient oneself in the world. So, for example, in my senior year of college, I interned at the Council on Foreign Relations, and then I went into studying American foreign policy. So, for me, at least, it was a hinge point in my life by presenting, the world as something that could be manipulated in a meaningful way by like actors who act in the world. And I think one of the important things for me was the disillusionment with that sort of agent-centered approach to historical transformation. And it really made it clear to me that it's, there are people involved, but, equally and in many instances more important, structures shaping the possibilities of action. And I think one of the reasons, and I'm very curious to see what you think about this, for the rise of millennial Marxism was the very clear indications of the response to the September 11, 2001 attacks, and then also the Great Recession of 08, 09. It made very clear that there are large structures that shape everything in our lives, which is very different from the culture that we were raised on in the 80s and the 90s. Sort of the Reagan era, the end of history era, which really put forward an agent-centered image of history, which was disproven by everything that happened after 9/11.
Yeah, I think for me, I didn't have the disillusionment because by that point, I was pretty convinced that any project that came out of 9/11 would be terrible. I took for granted that every response was wrong and awful and violent and obviously I didn't think about it too much because why would anyone even argue with you about it? But I kind of took for granted, Afghanistan, probably have to go into Afghanistan, even though now we know that's absolutely untrue. But very quickly, the Iraq thing curdled any association I had with the 9/11 project as being in any way redeemable. But I had no countervailing idea of a good thing that those people in power could have imagined you could do, So it, I think, broke me away from feeling a sense of empowerment in my own life because everything just felt so out of control. I did invest myself deeply in beating Bush in 2004, of course, just as a spectator. But that's how I adapted to this. That's how I coped. I was radically alienated from this order, but I was also relatively materially comfortable in it. So I just decided to really pay attention really hard. And so in that respect, yes, my destiny was shaped by it because it was the horror of the Iraq war and the lies leading up to it that turned me into this like politically identified person, even if it was just as a consumer of news and opinion.
And that gets us into the really interesting question of the internet, because, the Gulf War is famously the war of the 24-hour news cycle. CNN, it really gives rise to CNN in a legitimate way. But 9/11 is, I would say, the first genuinely internet driven, or at least internet consumed war, where you have these networks of people with, fast Wi-Fi, relatively speaking. Well, it's not Wi-Fi, I guess at that point it was tethered, fast Ethernet cables consuming this news event in real time. And one of probably my two biggest memories of 9/11, besides the immediately hearing about it, was the Onion, the famous Onion pieces that came out about world is now bad, Jerry Bruckheimer movie. And then the also woman doesn't know what to do, so she bakes flag-shaped American cake. So I also think it's important for foreshadowing the types of collective experiences that we would be having for the next 20 years, particularly in relation to politics, where we are consuming this news. We feel a simulacrum of connection and agency, like you did with the John Kerry campaign, but we're not actually shaping politics in any meaningful way. And I think that's where we find ourselves in terms of American democracy. And I want to hear you speak to the role of the internet, but I think 9/11 also suggested very important things about American democracy itself.
Well, because these things happened almost simultaneously, the emergence of a World Wide Web and 9/11, you have both the creation of this new heightened degree of social interconnectivity and also the cultural language that it's going to speak. So at the same time, you get the ability to communicate across the United States instantaneously. You also get the war on terror and its logic as the predominating discourse and heuristic for the universe for the world that you're now going to be interacting with. So the world you're now creating through this internet discourse is this trauma-ravaged maniac brain that is fixated wildly irrationally on an existential threat that does not exist. Because rationally, 9/11 happens. It's like, that sucks. Not a big deal. There's a 9/11's worth of people dying of COVID right now every 2 days, and it's bad, but it's something we can handle. It's something that can be managed not from a position of civilizational conflict and military conflagration, from a bureaucratic management position, something that cannot be emotionally invested in. But instead, even though it ended up being an isolated incident, and every terror attack that happened after that coincidentally turned out to be an entrapment plot by the FBI, which really does raise questions about how the one big one wasn't. The single big one that worked, but every other subsequent one, no, those ones weren't real, but that one, we swear to God, that was real. So our priorities, our understanding of the world and our politics and our countrymen was completely distorted. And so the next 20 years is politically a search for an other to defeat. And first, for a while there, it was bin Laden and the terrorists. But once they receded from our grasp after we ground our imperial machinery ground to a halt in Mesopotamia, that it turned inward. And we have been, ever since then, ever since Obama really, on a cultural search for the enemy to destroy. But now it's us, because our dream of the imperial domination has died in the desert, and someone has to be responsible for it.
So this, to me, indicates, and a lot, well, let's just say a lot of people have noted that a language of trauma defines internet communication, and that everyone is variously traumatized in different ways, and everyone needs to be aware of each other's traumas at all moments, particularly on the political left, and particularly probably people under 40, 45. I don't think 65 or 70-year-olds are thinking in this way, which suggests to me that the fact that when we were all coming online, literally as people and also literally on the internet, we're dealing with this traumatic moment, and the language of national trauma, particularly after 9/11, the 3-4 years between 2001 and let's say 2005, the language of national trauma really permeated everything that everyone discussed. And I wonder if that's meaningfully connected to the way that people actually interact of our generation on the internet. This, nebulous identification of traumas, where to be alive is to be traumatized, which was very much the language of what it was to be an American in the years after 9/11. To be an American was to be totally traumatized, even if you lived, in the middle of Iowa and have no organic connection to 9/11, right? And so I'm wondering, I had never thought about this before, but I'm wondering if there's actually a profound connection between these things that, that Max Weber would have said had an elective affinity with one another.
I think that's absolutely, it's facile probably, but it resonates so hard, because that fact that everything is traumatizing. That should be liberation. Because if everything is traumatizing, then you have to work through it and move on. And you have to be in the world with an understanding that you are traumatized, not a constant terror of being traumatized, because that's irrational, because life is being traumatized. And instead of that as the assumption, the assumptive logic of the all the issues people talk about are done by the government, and the government is doing the war on terror. But more than anything else, of course, it's also deregulating the real estate economy and guaranteeing the destruction of the economy. But nobody's noticing that. That's, of course, all off the table. That's not done by the state as embodiment of popular will. It's done by the state as an administrative bureaucracy. So it's just happening, churning in the background, the destiny of the country being decided, and we're in this existential battle where the next trauma will destroy us. Like, that was the first, and the next will be the end of us. And that echoes through every interaction we have. Like, the language of, I have to avoid this trauma at every level is because you think it's going to be the trauma that breaks you, because that's the logic of terror that was imposed after 9/11.
And you see it very materially with the creation of things like the color coding, the see something, say something, right? The life was presented to you as basically being a split second away from total disaster. And that must have shaped the way that we very much approach the world.
And I honestly think that you would not have quite as indelible a paranoia in setting the stage for 21st century politics and culture without the anthrax letters. Because that, for the people who were able to keep it in perspective of like, well, it's one building, it's 4 planes, that would suck, but I could get hit by a car. The fucking anthrax in the mail, in the air, did make it a more reasonable fear that they might actually get you, even if you lived in Bumblefuck. And just as a parenthetical, the fact that goddamn anthrax was milled at Fort Detrick, fucking Maryland, and we still don't know who sent it. You really think that, like, even if 9/11 was just, these mad Arabs did this and we just missed all those clues, oops, even if that's true, I think it's the point where the deep state becomes algorithmic. Like, the neoliberal turn is the turn towards the final algorithmic completion of neoliberal decision-making. The Skynet turning on, put it glibly. Like, once you have sufficiently abstracted economic decisions from popular will in the most important country, which is what happened in the late 70s in the United States, then in a real way, a zone of political power of human autonomy has been removed. You can no longer, from popular outside the popular forces that we have and that we exist within and that we know exist, we cannot use them to change an outcome now at a deep level. Like, we're stirring the ship here. Like, we're steering the ship towards planetary apocalypse, basically, because we are not going to try to negotiate some sort of multilateral world where power is distributed more evenly and resources go from production to need as opposed to profit. You can't have that. So you're just going to, not by your own desire as people, even at the highest level, you have set a course for destruction that all subsequent people now have to deal with. But they're dealing with it with reduced political tools and reduced bureaucratic tools, as computing power does a lot of the thinking work in the administrative state. It's being turned into an algorithm. It's being put more and more onto the cloud, to the point where by the time you have a bunch of pissed off Muslims, quote unquote, planning their terror attack with the explicit aid and direction of the Saudi state, which is an American partner in a general project of undercutting secular and left-wing Arab nationalism in favor of Saudi-directed Islamism, they have a state interest in seeing this attack succeed to complete their identification with, the project of resisting in the Middle East the imposition of capitalism. And it's a redirection of that anger and alienation and terror of being subsumed. And that means somebody's got to get blown up in America. And that means the Saudi state has an interest in seeing it blown up. And that means the American state has an interest in seeing it blown up because, as we said, without an event like this, they're fucked. Like, how are we supposed to deal with a real? It's not going to be no 9/11. We have flowers and ponies. No, you're still going to have economic crashes and depressions and real shit happen because of the redistribution of resources through the system of capitalism, the reduction of America's role as this preeminent country into one of many within a capitalist organism. And that's going to be traumatic and it's going to be violent, but it also might overthrow the established political order. So it could not have been allowed to happen. So at every level within the state, once you find out there's this plot to blow up the World Trade Centers, instead of doing what you could to end it, which ability you have, you do whatever you can to make sure it happens. So you have the system essentially doing a conspiracy theory that is then carried out by minions within the political order and in the bureaucratic state who simply have no other choice but to do it. Because if they don't, they'll just get fired and they'll be replaced by somebody who will do it because the system at this point is producing people who are willing to do inhuman things.
And what's really interesting about that analysis is how focused it is on structure, which gets back to, I think, my larger point, which is that 9/11 is a real hinge point for shaping how people around our age approach literal history and historical causation, where agents don't seem as powerful as they might have appeared in previous moments of history where it seemed like we had control over the system. Marx eventually, one of his many right-on predictions was that at some point we would be so alienated from the systems that humanity had created is that they would drive history. And I think what 9/11 did was it suggested to many people that was true, particularly younger people who lived through it. And so that suggests that 9/11 was another form of hinge point. I think you're right, as you gestured to in your answer, that the big hinge point for the economy and neoliberalism is really the 70s. That's when the algorithm begins to become conscious of itself, and these systems start operating in the political economy, the international political economy, outside of human agency in I think a meaningful way. Capitalism becomes genuinely global in the 1970s. I think in a way that's unique in world history. But when we're thinking about politics, 9/11 is particularly interesting because basically the deal that the American state and the agents within it made with the American public in 1945, which is that, we talked a lot about social democracy in the 1930s and extending the franchise, but, we're going to fight the Soviets. And the Soviets are an existential threat, just like the Nazis were. The Soviets are a gigantic state. They're, presented an alternative ideology. They're in 1949 get nuclear weapons. And before that, they have tons of people stationed in Europe in what becomes the Eastern Bloc. So the deal that the American state made with the American public is, listen, we're going to tamp down democracy for a little bit. We're going to have the National Security Council. A foreign policy making power is going to be, centered in the executive branch. Congress, which according to the Constitution is supposed to declare war, is not going to actually declare war anymore. And in fact, we're never going to declare war again. The United States last declared war in 1942. So the deal that the American state makes with the public is like, listen, you guys you're not going to make the most important decisions in terms of foreign policy and what the United States is going to be in the world, the global empire. But, one day when the Soviets actually end, then things will return to you. I think that a lot of people saying that didn't think they would ever end. I think a lot of people thought that the Soviet Union was basically going to continue to exist with the United States, which they were very happy about because it provided a reason for being for this American state. But, horror upon horrors, the Soviet Union actually does collapse for a variety of reasons, both internal and external. Between 1989 and 1991, the communist project collapses. The dream of communism is ended definitively, and you have the declaration of the end of history. Nonetheless, what we saw in the 1990s was that giving back of power to the American public that was initially promised in the middle of the 1940s never happened, right? So that was supposed to happen. According to the deal that was made by the demos with the state, once the existential threat went away, you were going to begin making decisions. But instead, you have this, this grand attempt, like Matt said, for George H.W. Bush to create a new world order. You have this turn to the United States being the global policeman, basically ending holocausts before they end. But while this is happening, there's this increasing recognition, I think, by the generation that's coming up that is more plastic in a sense, that hasn't been, totally ideologically contaminated by their lived experiences. The generation coming up, the people who made movies like Office Space and Fight Club, are becoming much more skeptical about the deal that they supposedly made with the American state. And they're beginning to realize that they don't have the power that they were initially promised. And what 9/11 does, it makes sure that power is never given back to them.
Absolutely. That's the door closing on it. And that doesn't mean no 9/11 is peaches and cream. It means that the aperture is wider. It means that the coming crises that are going to define American life are going to have a wider set of possible answers to, which means people might be able to, using this new internet, compare notes along their lived experiences and understand, hey, it turns out the way we're getting fucked over is by money. It's not really any of these boogeymen that we've been put up around here. It's our bosses, and that all the power we're alienated from is the power of bosses exemplified. Fuck, maybe we should do something about that. And given the increased democratization of technology, maybe they could have made something of it. But 9/11 ensured that everyone coming of age in the real crisis point, like the point when all of our temporary boosters to the economy, all our little bubbles and real estate scams, they're all collapsing. The big MLM that we did after 1980 is now collapsing. Shit. They're literally going to now live in a reduced social contract that they did not that they didn't sign up for, that they did not accede to. How the hell are they going to fucking process that? And because they're now we're all out now looking through the lens of this paranoid, traumatized world of seeking an enemy to destroy, it means that we have to turn inward. And so, of course, politics since Obama has increasingly been pivoted towards this internal enemy that we must try to use the state to the capacity we can to defend ourselves from.
And it's also, if we think about it from this hyperstructural level, it provides an explanation as to why Obama so quickly institutionalized this sort of ad hocracy that George W. Bush created in the global war on terror. And essentially, he just basically made this a permanent feature of American imperial behavior, and represented most recently by the fact that even though Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, he said in no uncertain terms in a speech he gave right after that the global war on terror is going to remain. And what we're doing is we're removing people so we could have this continuing structure to basically recirculate money between America's defense contractors and mercenaries.
And between the war that Bush pursued and the war Obama pursued, you can really see the way that there is division within the ruling elite as to how exactly to go about these things that they have to do. Like, they have to impose this war on terror, but they can argue about how to go about it. The Bush years were a imperial hubristic overreach by a ideologically coherent minority of bureaucrats and political figures around the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party, who were at all the crucial decision-making points and believed, after having witnessed American power slay the Soviet Union and then reorder the globe, fight off nationalist and illiberal threats from all over the world, internally and externally, and then they rightly thought, well, how fast does this baby go? Well, we've never taken it to fourth gear. Before we accede to a global decline of American power, how about we just see what happens when you press this button? And they pursued that policy, which was, fuck invisible empire. We're going to plant our military machine at the heart of the global reserve of oil, which undergirds the global monetary system more than anything. We got rid of its dollars after the 70s went from being backed by gold to being backed by oil. And you are literally going to redefine the political economy of the Middle East from the barrel of a gun. They tried it. They bungled it because they were limited in there are known unknowns, you see. And then there are the unknown unknowns, and those fucked them. Then in the aftermath of that, Obama is able to evaluate the wreckage and come to the conclusion, okay, we can't do that. We can't plant the flag anymore. It's not viable. But we now have this structure of almost infinite international power in the form of this skeletal techno drone war and special forces war, where we can maintain our military expenditures around things like the Afghanistan occupation and then keep them viable by trimming the grass, basically, with a fucking technologically abstracted military that involves very little to zero American soldiers' involvement, limiting the amount of domestic blowback caused by it, and also making it easier to do, and making it so that you can do it basically anywhere that there is insufficient power to stop you. So the Horn of Africa, Western Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia are just open season for this new regime. And although he dabbled in undermining Assad and trying to overthrow Syria, it was always with the understanding that it was going to have to be on the cheap. And then when the question of, are we going to go in with both feet, was presented to him, he said no, because this was an alternative vision of how to go about this new fully determined American imperium. And he is saying, instead of big noisy invasions, which we know are too costly, small, cool, technological interventions.
And then what Trump did was essentially institutionalize that even more and just do it more and worse. So what Trump did was he did more drone strikes, he did more special forces, and now this is precisely what Biden is institutionalizing.
The problem for the political class, the ones who are trying to steer the ship, is that while they're doing this, while they're extending out past the death of the imperial dream of the neoconservatives into this eternal war on terror, the political ground underneath their feet domestically is giving away because conditions continue to deteriorate. In the aftermath of the '08 crash, you have a new social order that has immiserated and precaritized people who, until this point in American history, have essentially never felt any sort of material precarity. That just absolutely traumatizes their faith in any of the governing institutions that these people represent. And it also makes their search for who to blame for their terror much more local, domestic, and intimate, because now they're not scared of themselves maybe getting an anthrax letter, or maybe, they're at Disneyland and they get shot by a guy. Still stuff that, even though it's more magnified in your head than it should be, still is not a daily present terror. These enemies domestically are robbing you of your ability to sustain yourself. And you can imagine that to be robbing you of your fucking life. And that means that machine we're building to trim the hedges elsewhere is inevitably now, at the final crisis point, coming inward.
But I think you're right. The quality is different, but one can see how the cast of mind is the same. And that's a cast of mind that's initially engendered by 9/11 as this crucial hinge point. And I think you see it across the political spectrum. You see it on the right with this nonsense about critical race theory. You see it in the center with, pretending that Trump is a fascist who's just about to enact Article 98 to overtake the entire the entire political system. And you see it on the left with some people also, identifying January 6th as an insurrection that threatened the republic, or Trump as someone who's in any way analogous to Hitler, but also in this sort of internecine battles that basically define left-wing politics online, which is still, again, reflective of this larger thing we were saying, where 9/11 close the aperture of actual democratic participation. So you see a bunch of these pathologies coming together to essentially embody how the downwardly mobile professional managerial class interacts within itself online.
Yeah. We are now at the end stage where the only thing left to do is to root for the state to annihilate your enemies. And the state is going to be annihilating a lot of people over time in order to bang them into shape to accept this new reality that's going to only continue to deteriorate. But the aperture of politics will exist for whoever is in power psychically, whoever imagines themselves in power, whoever is rooting for one team, gets to psychically get pleasure from all of the misery that is being inflicted on people they don't like, and all the misery that is inflicted on people they like. That anger is transferred onto the people they don't like. Like, the state is doing this horrible stuff to people I like, but that's only happening because of them. And that is how both sides view the crisis of American capitalism that we're currently living through, and that is absent completely from the political discussion. Bernie Sanders tried to bring it back in, and he got way farther than you would have thought a few years earlier, but the material base to generate support for him was gone. The attention that the people who needed to hear him paid to politics was gone, because they'd lived a whole adult life to see politics lie to them. They probably believed in Obama, and they were taught over 8 years that they were fucking idiots for having believed in him. So when Bernie comes along, he's going to get some young people, some idealistic people, but the older people, even if they've had it nothing but shit, and even if they agree with Bernie completely, they just don't care, because what is politics to them but a show? And that's what it is for all of us. The only difference is some of us are more psychically invested in it. And that is why my alternative to my 9/11 would involve, say, the terror attack is thwarted. And it becomes newspaper headlines, but, hijackers stopped from doing this thing. And it becomes a story for a while. It's like, holy shit. But it gets totally overwhelmed in the newspapers. Meanwhile, everybody who failed to do the 9/11 is working hard to do 9/11-2. They're in the studio mixing 9/11-2 the second that doesn't work. But that takes a while. And in the meantime, the American political scene is defined by Enron. The connections between Enron and the Bush administration, which were pretty eyebrow-raising. Bush flew in the Enron airplane during the 2000 campaign. He had Ken Lay on his short list for energy secretary. This kind of stuff was, before 9/11, people were looking for anything to care about. That was the summer of the Sharks and Chandra Levy. Like, people were just manic for anything to care about because there was no real defining issue. That could have been it. This reality of, all of these corporate houses of cards that we put together over the last 20 years telling you, no, we're really building an economy. They're all collapsing. They were all hollow the whole time. And then you have perhaps a 2008 election where Bernie Sanders is the nominee. And that language of resistance to capitalism has got a voice at a moment when downwardly mobile middle-class people who are experiencing this abrupt decline in their standard of living and the prospects of their families is listening to politics enough to pick someone they're rooting for. Some of them give them money, but others of them vote for them. And then you have a possibility where Bernie could be that FDR 2.0 figure that he was trying to be, but that tragically he was just too late for, because 9/11 just drove a dagger into that way of doing politics.
And I think that's probably one of the most critical things that 9/11 does. If you imagine that it never happened, I think the 07 to 09 crisis is read differently. And there's a lot of resources available to the reaction that aren't otherwise available. So let's say, the crisis happened relatively in the same way. I don't think you necessarily have things like the Tea Party, which are really trading on a decade of extreme patriotism. And probably a lot of the social connections upon which the original Tea Party was made were formed in sort of these 9/11 things. You don't have Benghazi, you don't have ISIS, right, which essentially serve as distractions from the political economic questions that otherwise might have been asked between 2008 and 2015, where Trump sort of like randomly, in the air, because he's such, he really has his finger to the wind, is able to see what's going on, as sort of this anger and this disillusionment brought about not only by the crash, but also the war on terror. So I think you have a lot of different things happening there. But one thing that I want to end on that we didn't discuss, we talked a little bit about in the 1990s how culture changed. And I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about how 9/11 changed culture. You get 24 in the first season, the bad guy's a Balkan. Later on, he's, Muslims of various stripes. You get all the torture debates. You get the Shield, all these other reactions to 9/11, Arrested Development. But one thing that I just want to hear your thoughts on, because I think it's interesting, especially because you've thought so much about Avatar. I wonder if you could maybe think about, Zero Dark 30 and Avatar in dialogue, especially because they were made by James Cameron and Catherine Bigelow, people who used to be married to each other, and who in these two movies, in a real way, reflect the different American strands and approaches to the world. I think in Cameron, as you've gestured toward, it's really a reflection of the peace movement, of the that was annihilated by World War II, which was really powerful before World War II. There were millions of people in the 20s and 30s United States who really advocated in favor of international peace and were really anti-imperialist. And these were mainstream people across the right and the left. And that sort of idea is embodied in Avatar, and we'll see how it's embodied or not in later iterations, but it's really reflected that. But on the other hand, Bigelow, her movies, The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30, both basically embody the sort of hypo-jingoistic, romantic, war is the place where men are truly made men. And it's the place where you find meaning, which defined the first decade of culture after 9/11. So I was thinking if you could maybe just reflect a little bit of how these movies relate to what was happening in 9/11 culture, given that they were made by people who had an incredible personal connection at one point to each other.
It is funny because Hurt Locker and Avatar came out the same year. They competed for the Best Picture Oscar. And Hurt Locker is about a bomb diffuser in occupied Iraq. And so the good guy, the main character, is this member of this military occupation. And then James Cameron's Avatar flips it so that the stand-in for the American military are doing 9/11 instead of being the victims of this thing. And that's like the fundamental propaganda that's going to power all that post 9/11 content, is because it takes that for granted. It takes the positionality for granted that we were harmed uniquely, even though compared to what the United States does everywhere in the world, it was a fucking shaving nick. And of course, it's impossible to imagine us responding to it any other way culturally, because we were Americans. We had been conditioned to that point. So yeah, there's no way that 9/11 gets spun away from the jingoistic nightmare it became. But James Cameron is like this voice saying, like, what if we had responded to this differently? What if we had taken a different position? And his art is like trying to reflect that parallel world.
And I think what's also really interesting is that Zero Dark 30, in particular, when you relate that to dialogue, Zero Dark 30 is all about analysis, right? It's literally about analyzing documents in order to get what you want, where Avatar is all about experience, right? Famously, people wanted to stay forever in the magical land. What's the name? I forget. In Pandora. And it was very experiential. So it's also very different approaches to art, where you have one focusing on the emotional lived experience of what it might feel like to be at the heart of on the wrong side of empire, and another one basically using games of logic and analysis to justify that empire.
Yeah, the point of view is always from the imperial center in all of the post 9/11 content that perpetuates the perspective, because it warps everything. It warps the risk matrix. It overemphasizes risks to the self, because the self is identified with this imperial point of view, and it downgrades other experiences, and it refuses any emotion other than the emotions associated with this war, this fear of a threat, as opposed to Avatar trying to make you live existence from the other side. But that perspective of like being the person having your home destroyed is alien, literally, to the point of view of the post 9/11 stuff like Zero Dark 30.
And so actually, I thought of something that I want to talk about for a second. So I'm sure when you remember when 9/11 happened, and particularly after the invasion of Iraq, everyone was saying that, there'd be a lot of good art. I think that the analogy was made to Vietnam, that Vietnam, birthed rock and roll and gave us, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and all these various things. But that didn't happen. So why do you think that? It's an interesting question that we never got like great anti-war and terror art. Was everyone just embedded in the project in a way that they weren't in Vietnam because they might have been drafted in Vietnam, and that was not a possibility during 9/11? Like the bourgeoisie that creates art wasn't nearly as effective, and so you don't get the art. But I think it's a pretty interesting question.
I think that's got a lot to do with it. There's, like I said, there's a remove. You are never going to be the victim of empire the way that, yes, somebody you're invading can be, but so can some poor schmuck who gets drafted to do the dirty work. And the War on Terror, I think not only the danger of what it would mean to be a troop is not felt by the people making any of the work, so there's that sort of disdain there, that level of remove, but also I think that most people making Iraq War, Afghanistan War art at a fundamental level believe in the project, which is not true of the people who made the Vietnam films, because they were against the war, the concept of a war in Southeast Asia, and they were willing to end it on any terms. I don't think most middle-class filmmakers and studio producers would be comfortable with the idea of just stopping fighting the war on terror. Now, they might say, I'd love to, but those Republicans, but they cannot fathom. Maybe beyond that, they can't even fathom not having it there. It's not an option. Whereas Vietnam felt optional, and therefore it felt like an option that we could stop pursuing. But I don't think that they feel that way. I feel like they think it is a fixed feature of American geopolitics. And so it has that sort of wistful fatalism at it. It can't have the passion and the outrage.
And I think that's a good place to end. Probably one of the biggest effects, or what 9/11 showed and why it's a real hinge point, is that it showed that Americans would be just fine with their empire if they weren't personally affected by it. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed Hinge Points.
Yeah.